Chapter 2284. Published at 1st of November 2023 1:18 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 2284. Leonel Morales. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2284. Leonel Morales. Leonel looked toward the pious ancestor indifferently, but they were just as confused as everyone else was. His gaze changed focus and he looked down toward the holy land of the pious family, but he knew that it was a waste of his time. If they left so abruptly, so much so that even he couldn't quite figure out immediately how they had, then there was no doubt in his mind that there was nothing of use left. They wouldn't be that foolish. He didn't feel any sort of satisfaction. He would have felt much better if that old man had just died, but next time they met he would know to watch his mouth. Not that it would matter much, next time they met, he'd have the man's head on a pike. Just because he had controlled his rage, didn't mean that it wasn't still there. That man's words were clearly meant to taunt, and taunting an enraged Leonel was the last thing a person should do. As for who that old man was, it was impossible to tell with the information he had. Even his talks about the Godlen family stabbing him in the back was nothing more than posturing. He had no idea what the Godlen family was or what their plans were. He was only just well aware that they were far more powerful than they let on. He was far too sharp to be fooled by their acting, or what they thought was acting. The youths they had sent to the air wars were far too arrogant to be from a six-dimensional family, and their lineage factor had far more potential than they were letting on. This and the fact that Simona had abandoned Aina and his brothers in their time of greatest need was enough for him to act against the pious family. He wouldn't blame her for her actions, at least not to the point of punishing her for them, but he also wouldn't continue to treat her like some great ally. Wasn't that a joke? What had the pious family done for him in the air wars? If a percentage were to be given, it wouldn't even be one. Leonel slowly walked from the palace, his squadron following him. Then, he raised his spear. The Morales army roared with victory and the pious constellation seemed to almost flicker entirely out of existence. It would take some time before all 12 territories were truly Morales. But every day that passed, every second even, and along with every new territory they conquered, the more furious that momentum became. Soon, the entirety would be their territory and no one in the human domain would be able to stop them. Bang! Matriarch Pius watched in silence as the old man kicked at a mountain furiously, causing it to crumble practically to ash. It was just a false mountain, one created by the hands of man, but it was just as large and sturdy as a real mountain. It was just unfortunate that it had caused the ambience of this peaceful garden to crumble. It was even worse that the old man seemed to have done it with a smile on his face. The old man exhaled as though he felt better and shook out his stumpy arms. Find me something that can heal my arms, quickly. I can't walk around like a muppet. Are you really all right, Mauve? Matriarch Pius asked. Don't question me in front of the child, woman. You'll ruin my prestige. I think you've done plenty of that on your own. The old man looked over. You're lucky that you're Mendel's woman. I think we both know it has nothing to do with luck, and also I am not his woman, I am his wife. Whatever helps you sleep at night, Mauve said casually. Not all of us need to lie to ourselves to be at peace. There's no lying about it. I told the dumbass Velasco that he would die if he continued on his path, and did he not? I told his father before him too, and didn't he also die? Now his grandson, and his son, will follow the same path. I might kill him myself if he crosses me again. If? You're well aware that you can't kill someone so important, Matriarch Pius said lightly. As for whether or not hell kill you because you can't control your tongue, well, that would be another matter entirely. Mauve didn't say anything. Also, you know well that the reason Velasco didn't listen to you is because you wanted him to spare the man responsible for his father's death. His father wouldn't have died at all had he just listened to me. Mauve said with finally a bit of bite in his voice. I have a feeling that these youths, these brats, these young men, as you so like to call them, might be far more insightful than you are. Every word out of your mouth is just yet another lie. N/OVLB and Mauve fell into silence again. Neither of them seemed eager to talk, actually, and it seemed that everything would come to a conclusion like this. But then, Mauve actually parted his lips once more. The human race needs some who are willing to make a sacrifice. It can't be the weak, it has to be a sacrifice from the strong, and not just the strong, but the strongest of the strong. If they aren't willing, if they insist on being selfish, if they are so wrapped in their own designs, their own rage, their own grief, then we have no chance. The human race will be wiped out from the whole of existence. Matriarch Pius didn't respond. The news of the collapse of the 12 constellation families, or rather the robbery of their world spirits and the claiming of their territory by the Morales, spread like wildfire. Though, this wasn't until weeks later, when messengers finally managed to get free of Lionel's suppressions, but by then, Lionel had already prepared the Morales for the next wave. In a certain HQ though, a familiar cross elder Avon received the news. He sat in silence for a long time before he suddenly exploded to his feet. Grabbing his indestructible desk, he roared and ripped it from the floor, launching it out of the glass window to his back. He furiously bellowed. Lionel Morales. Chapter 2285. Published at 1st of November 2023 1:18 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 2285. Cross Elders. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2285. Cross Elders. Cross Elder Avon was absolutely furious. He remembered when he first met Lionel. He could have crushed that little shit immediately. Daring to steal the property of Shield Cross Stars, and such an important property at that, was unforgivable. To make matters worse, he had actually been a fugitive for so long. He deserved nothing but death. What others didn't know was that Shield Cross Stars had been targeting Lionel ever since he exited the Camelot Zone. The failure to claim that zone for them was an unacceptable loss, and it was felt that the best way to gain the benefits they wanted was through Lionel. Unfortunately, there was only so much that they could do while maintaining the same level of caution. He had wanted to throw it to the winds, but he wasn't the only one making decisions. There were several other cross elders, each with their own factions and their own thoughts on the matter. And now look what happened. He had wanted to launch a full assault on Earth the instant Emperor Fox had thrown him out of their territory, but he had gotten word from above that it was unsafe. He had wanted to strike to kill during the air wars, but he once again received word that it was ill-advised. He wanted to send a lone ancestor to ensure that Lionel would die during the human domain invasion, and yet he was once again rebuffed. And now what? He was standing here, more than half of the most powerful forces of the human domain effectively crippled and fallen under the power of the Morales, who were already gathering far too much power, and it was already far too late to take any sort of easy, but drastic action. Lionel had somehow already gained the ability to protect himself from ancestors, even setting aside his armies. There were those modified starships, and even setting aside those modified starships there were still the reports that over a dozen ancestors had died in battle, and yet there was no use that Lionel had made use of them yet. The sight of Lionel resurrecting ancestors of the foreign races and then slaughtering over 50 ancestors under his own power was something that was burned into Cross Elder Avon's psyche. Now, Lionel had even more ancestors than he had had back then, and they were a trump card in his back pocket that he could use at any time. This news was as bad as it could be, or so it seemed. Because what came afterward was even worse than that. This news was delayed, by several weeks at that. Lionel had immediately used the conquering of the world spirits to restrict information moving in and out of the 12 territories. Although he wouldn't be able to use the full strength of those territories anytime soon, this required almost no strain at all. If information wanted to get out, it had no choice but to move through more normal channels, and how long would that take? How vast was the human domain? How many families were there? How many would fear what it would mean to betray Lionel by leaking this information? And these families, who were cut off from the outside world as well, how could they know that they weren't the only ones to suffer at Lionel's hands? For all they knew, they were the only ones to suffer, and sending this news out would do nothing more than expose the fact that they had lost their world spirits, making them vulnerable as a whole. Ironically, then, those families actually helped Lionel keep a lid on his escapades for fear of what it would do to them until they confirmed that other families had suffered the same fate. No, not just until this, but until they understood that enough had suffered the same fate that it wouldn't be easy to target them all at once. It was only then that they allowed the information to flow smoothly and it finally reached the ears of Shield Cross Stars. And that was precisely what set Cross Elder Avon off. N-OVLB in each one of these territories had Shield Cross Stars branches within, but these powerful families didn't trust those branches as far as their youth could throw them. They were restricted to the outskirts, and Lionel had passed right through most of them without even attacking. However, the same wasn't true on the way back. Lionel left most of the outskirts of these territories unscathed. He used the expertise of the geniuses he had snatched to learn of the structure of their outposts and make it past them without any warning at all, and then he directly attacked their capital cities without any warning. But he didn't do the same for Shield Cross Stars. It was like he was provoking them, like he was spitting in their faces. He unceremoniously slaughtered them all, or so Cross Elder Avon's thought. All he knew was that aside from strips of blood and flesh, their branches were deserted of people, strangled and practically wiped from existence. He didn't respect them at all. He slapped each one of their faces and it was practically like he was taking a piss over their walls. Cross Elder Avon's infuriated roar echoed through the capital of Shield Cross Stars and it was like a call that brought all of the Cross Elders together at once. Some young, some old, they rushed into Cross Elder Avon's ravaged office as his eyes spit with flames, literally. Cross Elders, men and women alike, looked around. Some sneered, some were somber, some found the situation amusing, and some were serious. It was clear by this meeting that the numbers given to the public for the number of Cross Elders was nothing more than a lie. In this room alone, more than 36 had gathered, many of whom not a single soul in the human domain would recognize. Do you see what you've all done? Do you see what you all have allowed? Cross Elder Avon barked, the temperature in the surroundings skyrocketing. Chapter 2286. Published at 2nd of November 2023 12:42 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 2286. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2286. Arrogance. There was a slight silence as the roar brewed, until a man with a particularly chilly disposition chuckled. This man was the overlord of the Sith family. This wasn't a well-known face in the human domain, but this wasn't because he was unknown like the others. Rather, it was because he was the greatest assassin in the human domain. What assassin worth his salt would allow the world to know his face? The Sith family led the assassination units of Shield Cross Stars. Lionel had met one of them before in Ronan, a man of the Void Palace that Lionel had once bought information from. He had also tried to stop Lionel and Aina from leaving the Void Palace when DiVincenzo had appeared, but Ronan was far more the man here. Overlord Sith was like a touch of darkness and a slice of ice. His clothing was a dense black, his skin a pale white, his hair was even darker than his robes, and his eyes were a piercing ice blue. Those that knew him realized that although his eyes could be said to be the only beautiful part of him, he absolutely hated them. They made his ability to be stealthy even more difficult than the whites of his eyes. But this was also why he was known as the Blind Sith, the visionless assassin. The number of deaths he had on his tally was enormous, and they included even experts of the other domains. Laugh again, Sith, and they'll slice out that tongue. Please do, Overlord Sith said with another laugh. It would be my pleasure to become a sightless and soundless assassin. I wonder if I would reach the true pinnacle of my path once I have done so. Many felt a shudder down their spines when he said this, but Avon only grew more infuriated and truly seemed as though he was about to attack. He had two others here who were the only ones that didn't fear this man. But whether it was by ability, or by ignorance, it was hard to tell. The other two were Overlord Vega and Overlord Lela, both women, both middle-aged, and both beautiful, the latter with radiant blue hair much like a certain Vega, sharing more than just a similar name, and the other had shimmering black. There were 4 factions of Shield Cross Stars. The commanding faction, led by Cross Elder Avon, the Dark faction, led by Cross Elder Sith, the logistical faction led by Cross Elder Lela, and the Shield faction, led by Overlord Vega. The commanding faction dealt with everything in the daylight. They were the ones that handled much of the politics. This sounded ridiculous, especially considering their leader was also the one with the worst temper. But leaders of these various factions weren't based on merit, they were hereditary, and if one wanted to take it from Cross Elder Avon, well, you'd have to step over his dead body. The dark faction spoke for itself. They worked in the shadows, and to the public, they dealt with the enemies that normal armies couldn't deal with. If the commanding faction was the broadsword, they were the change weapon, the small dagger pulled out in a pinch. In reality, though, their work was likely far more sinister than this, and they were responsible for the largest and most in-depth information network in the whole of the human domain. No, it was more accurate to say that they had spread even beyond the human domain. As for how deep they had gone, it was likely that Overlord Sith was the only one who had the knowledge to explain this. The logistical faction did as its name suggested, much like the other two. They were the cleanup crew that acted after the commanding and dark faction had finished up their work, and they also had the largest collection of healers, and the strongest of this kind, in the whole of the human domain. Healers weren't exactly a profession like crafters or force pill crafters, but they could be. Some were true professionals, and studied much like doctors did. But others simply had powerful ability indexes that didn't require such effort. The best of them had a combination of both. A point of interest was that the Vieira family, led by their young genius who had once had a great deal of conflict with both Lionel and especially Aina for taking her spot on the rankings, had recently joined their ranks. The Shield faction was more complicated than the others. Even many of the upper echelon of Shield Cross Stars didn't understand exactly what they did, but those here most definitely did. What could be said was that they both had the weakest authority of those present, and at times, had authority surpassing even that of the commanding faction. As for their leader, Overlord Vega, she was the quietest of them all. Of the more than 36 Cross Elders here, they were quite evenly distributed amongst the factions, except for the Shield faction, which both had the largest variety, and the largest number of them. That's enough, Overlord Lela said lightly. I still stand by our earlier decisions. The child also hasn't done anything significant, and definitely nothing that relies on himself solely. The main power behind everything is the Morales family, and so long as they are dealt with, the child is still not a problem. Your demeanor is unbecoming of the head of the commanding faction. Speak to me like that again, woman, and see if I don't rip your head off. Avon snarled. I am not worried about a child, but it's been 3 generations now, 3 generations of you all saying the same things. The second was already far better than the first and cost us countless losses, and now the third feels even more powerful than the second was, on top of the fact all monitoring attempts on the once unproblematic uncle has now failed as well. Do you still think that we have control? Your arrogance will be your death. Avon spoke in a low roar. Chapter 2287. Published at 2nd of November 2023 12:42 and 22 seconds PM. Chapter 2287. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2287. Overlord Vega's silence fell, but Avon could tell with a single glance that none of these people had taken anything he had said seriously. And yet, instead of becoming more enraged, his lip curled into a sneer, a reaction that caught them off guard. They showed much more of a reaction to this than they had to anything else. King is dead. The words hung in the air, and then suddenly rushed through them all at once. What? Overlord Lela asked with a frown. Did I stutter, dumb woman? King is dead. Explain. Lela said coldly. I was contacted a week ago with this information. And why are you only telling us about this now? Because I both wanted to see your stupid faces and understand what the fallout of that matter is. Also, in case you've forgotten, the head of the commanding faction is me, not you. When I'm contacted with information, it's up to me how it's divulged. How did he die? Overlord Vega, who hadn't spoken until now, suddenly asked. Avon was surprisingly straightforward this time, without any fanfare. Velasco killed him. What? Oh. Now you all understand that I'm not just chatting horseshit. I told you all to take this matter seriously, and you refused to time and time again. I've not been fooled. The reason you all dragged your feet is because you feared him, and maybe you were right to. But now his brother is nowhere to be seen, and his son is rampaging across the human domain as the time approaches, and you're still dragging your feet. What, are you going to wait until he's as strong as his father before you act? Avin had a sneer of satisfaction intertwined with his words. He looked like he was on a high horse despite the fact this problem was one that was on his plate as well. The cult is actually so useless, Overlord Sith said coldly. Oh. Is it the cult's fault now? What happened to the mighty assassin? Aren't you in love with a challenge? What better challenge would there have been for you if not that one? Overlord Sith remained silent, but the coldness in his blue gaze deepened as though he might lunge forward and attack Avin right this moment. But Avin only greeted the stare, hoping that the Sith really would attack. He had still not finished venting his wrath. We were placed here to monitor Earth, to gather its resources before they could be made use of by others and help the great families to stabilize their position and minimize the variables. We've failed on all accounts. Emperor Fox grew powerful on our watch, the greatest treasures of Earth are only partially under our control, and now the lineage factor of the Fox is flourishing once again. Avin's brows jumped as he was not the one to speak. It was Overlord Vega, and hearing such words, he couldn't help but become serious. The situation was going well, mostly so in the last 30 years. Over 95% of the greatest benefits that could be gained from Earth had fallen into the hands of the great families and there was nothing the Fox could do. But then, just 2 years ago, everything changed instantly. The established powers of the great families were eradicated to their last man. The territory of the Ascension Empire expanded wildly and without check. All of the branches of Shield Cross Stars, prepared and ready for the worst-case scenario, were eradicated. Then, their borders were stabilized so quickly that future infiltration was deemed nigh impossible. Do you know what happened 2 years ago? Overlord Vega asked lightly. Lionel Morales somehow reversed the schemes of the cult and returned from the vast bubble. A silence fell once more, and this time, Avin could sense the seriousness in their expressions, a seriousness they had never given him. In those years, Velasco was occupied by the court, the Fox were restricted by his bindings, and there was no war, there was only a systematic dismantling of everything that was left of our enemies. A single young boy reversed it all, and the sacrifice the cult had made was almost rendered all but useless. It wasn't useless, most of Earth's resources were taken. Overlord Vega gave Avin a glance and he suddenly felt like his throat was gripped, but his usual temper didn't allow him to back down and he met the woman's stare. As good as those resources were, they are nothing compared to what is being gathered now. This version of Earth, the one on the verge of the 8th dimension, contains the most valuable of the loot. Lionel Morales has already entered one, and he returned far stronger than should be possible for a 7th dimensional existence of this world. Avin fell into silence. This is not a matter that can be taken lightly. I've never liked the cult. Their views don't align with our own, and the direction they want to take the human race is abhorrent. However, they, just like the rest of us, understand that these incomplete worlds are our final chance and nothing can be allowed to go wrong. The existence of Fox in this world has opened us up to a great deal of variables, and each one seems more dangerous than the last. The cult's presence in this world has been ground to almost nothing, and those of the Dream Pavilion have yet to make their presences known. From this moment forth, I will be taking command of Shield Cross Stars, and our next movements will be decided by me. All commanding rights will likewise be handed over, and the full cooperation of the faction leaders will be expected and required. Vega tapped the emblem on her lapel and the shield began to glow. The kilted skirt of the organization fluttered and the metal shin guards beneath shone. The overlords felt a flash of anger when they sensed what was happening, but soon an illusory chain constricted their hearts and their movements. Shield Cross Stars was now fully under Vega's control. Chapter 2288. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:57 and 1 second AM. Chapter 2288. Wait here if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2288. Wait here. Lionel sat in silent meditation. His expression didn't carry any hints of happiness, just focus. He had done nothing in these last several weeks other than meditate on his vital star force. He gave it all the attention he had. Or, at least, this version of him had. When he returned home triumphant, the Morales elders had nothing more to say. To use 120 million soldiers to conquer just one world spirit of a constellation family was shocking enough. Such a number was too far from the number of elites that were present in just one of these families. And yet, Lionel had used that number to take on 12. If the status quo remained like this, in a year, the territory of the Morales would grow by more than 10 times, and there would be almost nowhere in the human domain that they couldn't go without having the advantage of suppression on their side. It was a realization that made them realize just what Lionel meant by saying that they were at an undeniable advantage. But maybe the most shocking part of all of this was that they hadn't lost a single person. Some had died, but they had been revived just as easily. The Morales had essentially given up nothing but a sputteringly small amount of resources in exchange for the most valuable treasure of each and every family. So, when Lionel gave them their next set of orders, they responded to them with sharp precision. When the third week came to an end, everything was prepared and Lionel slowly opened his eyes. As he did, the sight of himself reflected in his irises. N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N. He didn't seem to be surprised by this, and why would he be? He simply touched his own hand and the two of them became one. All of the insights he had made into Vital Star Force came together as well, but unfortunately it still wasn't enough for a breakthrough, but he had expected this as well. He took a step out of his meditation room and found his squadron of 10 waiting for him. But these 10 weren't just any 10, he knew them all too well. Joel, Arnold, James, Milan, Raj, Franco, Drake, Alan, Gil, and the latest addition, Raylion. These 10 hadn't participated in many battles, and he had purposely had them hold back during the air wars as he never had intention of going all out for that battle. Since then, they had only grown ever stronger. They had benefited greatly from the rewards Lionel had gotten for winning the air wars. Each and every single one of them was already in Tier 9 of the 7th dimension, but this was also because they had entered the 6th dimension using the conventional path. Progressing for them was as easy as absorbing more resources. What was difficult was making it so that they could absorb more resources for the same increase in benefits. This required changing their very foundations, something that was far easier than it should have been, now that they had died before. When Lionel had resurrected Armand and the others of the Constellation families using Breathe, he had done so with an ore instead of the silver tablet. That was more of an experiment than anything, a successful one at that. What he had been testing was how much he could improve someone's talent through the use of his lineage factor. The result was beyond his expectations because it was far easier than it should have been. In Lionel's views, this only proved one of two things. Either the Fox family lineage factor was just that powerful, or the people of this incomplete world were simply that weak. In reality, it was a combination of both. But at the same time, it was also in great thanks to Tolliver. When it came to Armand and the blood diamond ore, Lionel had just chosen something that was close enough and tested it out. However, when it came to his brothers, not only did he pick out such ores, but he used little Tolly's abilities to fuse them together, forming them into new ores that perfectly matched their paths. Little Tolly could only create 6-dimensional ores, but Lionel had realized after meeting Elryan that dimension was next to irrelevant. In fact, it probably would have been better the lower their dimension was. It would only make it easier to reforge their foundations. The stronger his crafting became, the more perfect the ores he would be able to forge with little Tolly, and the stronger he could make his brothers. So long as they were willing to experience death and trust him with their souls, he could take them as far as he could go. And now, while each one wasn't yet as strong as junior ancestors, together with their armor, they could kill as many came their way. Once they settled in with their new talent and their force manipulation caught up, even junior ancestors wouldn't be a match for them. And with him leading them, even ancestors weren't their match. "Let's go," Lionel said lightly. They all vanished at once, and when they appeared outside the segmented cube, they found a sky filled with starships. It wasn't just one or two, it wasn't even just a few dozen, there were hundreds. In the whole of the human domain, even in the whole of the dimensional verse, the number of ancestors didn't greatly surpass this number. And yet, just one of these starships could take out an army of them on their own. Overlord Morales appeared by Lionel's side. No one knew who this old man was, and he even looked like Lionel's advisor to most. No one would guess that this man was one of the strongest of the Morales family. Are you certain? Why risk the lives of the most valuable Morales? Lionel asked. At this point, I think it's fairly certain that the most valuable Morales is you. I don't think you mean that, Lionel said with a smile. You're too clever for your own good, child. Lionel's lip curled. Wait here for news of victory. Chapter 2289. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 2289. Rude if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2289. Rude. Lionel stepped onto the head starship, his focus trained and his gaze sharp. He didn't rush this time, nor did he hide his movements. This time, they would be cautious, they would be ready. Trying to sneak around would have the opposite effect. It would dull the momentum of his army and scatter them unnecessarily. No. This time they would be bold, direct, vicious and swift. The scouts that the various families had placed around the territory of the Morales noticed the movement instantly and made their reports one after another. The entire human domain seemed to be lit on fire. Many had speculated about what the Morales would do. Even some smart strategists thought that it would be best if they took their time, waiting for the constellation families to bleed out, so to speak. The closer the Morales came to those territories truly being theirs, the less chance the rest of the human domain would have in dealing with them. At the same time, they were the most powerful within their own territory, especially now that they had formed their own constellation. But how could they know? The news of the Morales victories had only just disseminated to the public, but to Lionel, it had been a foregone conclusion for weeks already, and in these weeks, he had done nothing but prepare. All the while, the first target was already decided. The Suyard family would crumble today. The Suyard family, a family standing at the peak of the human domain, unsurprisingly had a long and storied history. Their mastery over the sword had begun long before the sword domain ring landed in their possession, but it had only gotten stronger since then. What was surprising, though, was that the Suyard family had once been a collection of Buddhist temples. The Suyard Temple, the Sina Temple, and the Suave Temple. Most who would learn of this history would find it to be ridiculous. Buddhist monks practiced in the art of killing? And what of their secondary lineage factor? One that seemed steeped in the aura of demons and devils? What about them could be related to Buddhism and what had happened since then for them to be in this situation now? To the Suyard family, though, these things were just a matter, of course. They were Buddhists who focused on the art of severing, to reach nirvana and escape suffering through severing all things that weighed down their lives. This was the way of the Suyard, Sina, and Suave families. It was hard to say how many of these teachings remained, but what was more curious than that was how the Suyard family evolved to their current state from where they had begun. The God path was an interesting one, but the Suyard family had once had their own path, only to conform to the ways of the rest of the human domain. Was this by coincidence, or were there other reasons? Maybe only the ancestors of the Suyard family would understand why it was that they had abandoned the path of their own. Or maybe that history would be buried on this very day. Ishmael, your grandson is as annoying as you were, an old man muttered. This old man was Amory's grandfather, and he seemed far too unworried for a man whose grandson was still very much missing. Maybe he was well aware that Amory was still alive, but even so, this sort of nonchalantness wasn't what one would expect from a situation like this one, especially since news of the Morales charge had already reached him. By now, the families knew that Lionel had used their geniuses to pry into all of their secrets. No amount of willpower would save Amory from the fate of having his thoughts and memories read like an open book. Amory wasn't just a normal genius, he was the future of their family, the hope that they had placed everything in. There wasn't any part of the Suyard family that he didn't have perfect information for. He even knew quite a great deal about the spiritual religion too. There was nothing that the Suyard family could do in a short time that would change the situation. Any tricks or trump cards they had were useless. There was no point in trying to hide them, and it was impossible to come up with anything even remotely as good or effective even given 10 years, let alone the few hours they had. However, even now, Max Suyard reclined in his rocking chair in the tallest tower of the Suyard family palace. He looked out over the approaching starships, his gaze unreadable. A young man met his gaze. He had translucent, pale violet, short-cut hair. His demeanor was quite sharp, yet subdued. His gaze, though, seemed to hide the tip of a spear, a blade capable of piercing through all things. Same annoying gaze, too. Max shook his head. The brat had actually picked him out already. Out of all the other things he could have been focused on, he was focused on this one in particular. He didn't know whether to be flattered or annoyed. N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N. Max stood from his rocking chair slowly. His eyes were as black as night, and his robes looked like they were knitted of thick, off-white thread. His feet were bare, and he looked completely unadorned. There was no spatial device, no sword, not even a belt for his waist. He didn't look like he was heading out for a fight, and rather looked like he was going to bed. And yet, when he seemed to still be taking his first step, he had already appeared before the starship. The lasers fired the moment his foot raised, but he had already passed them by as a searing hole was torn through the Suyard family palace. A flame sparked and Max's rocking chair was lit ablaze along with the rest of his room. That was rude, young man. Is this how you treat your elders? Chapter 2290. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 2290. I see if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2290. I see Lionel looked toward this elder before him without much of a reaction. However, the calmness of his expression had nothing to do with how alert he was. The starship had never failed up until this point, at least not in such close proximity, or what would be considered relative close proximity. Even Elryan hadn't managed to dodge it. Though, granted, not only was the Pluto not harmed to the point of lethality, but he was also far closer to the strike. Even so, the feat of dodging the starship's attack and most importantly, the starship under the control of Lionel's skill was absolutely ridiculous. This person must be Amory's grandfather, Overlord Max Suyard. Lionel had learned quite a bit about this man in recent days, or at the very least, he had learned everything that Amory knew about him, as much as a grandchild could know about his grandparent. That could either be quite a bit, or nothing at all depending on the temperament of the grandparent in question. And judging by the reaction of this old man, Lionel had a feeling that it was by far the latter. Don't be like that, I used to know your grandfather, you know. We could be considered good friends. Why don't you step out and we can have a chat? Lionel didn't say anything, continuing to look at the old man. The more he did, the more he felt that the words, old man, didn't really fit Max. He was too vibrant, too full of vitality. He seemed to have as much life ahead of him as a newborn. Comparing him to the older generation felt wrong. Max sighed when Lionel had no intention of taking him up on his offer. There were quite a number of things that he couldn't talk about so openly, and this brat insisted on making things hard on him. What an annoyance indeed. Overlord Suyard took another step and he vanished. This time, Lionel saw it clearly. This man wasn't a spatial force expert at all, rather his attainments in the sword were so high that he might as well have been. Lionel was certain with a single glance that that sword force was, at a minimum, at the impetus state. He wasn't crossing space, his sword quite literally sliced reality apart, shattering any concepts of distance until his destination was just a single step away from him. To call this man an overlord felt like an insult to him. He had already met the requirement to enter the 9th dimension, and the only reason he hadn't was likely because of the restrictions of this world. By the time Lionel's mind had finished processing all of this, Max had appeared within the starship, sitting across from Lionel as though he had always been there. His expression was quite casual, until he seemed to realize that Lionel's was just as casual. But after a momentary gaffe, he calmed down again. Has anyone ever told you that you're very annoying? I'm glad that you're not my grandson. I'd have to spank your bottom red every day just to vent a bit. N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Don't you have any refreshments here? Really? I'm sure your grandfather taught you better than this, you're just ignoring his teachings. Max shook his head. Forget it, this is a waste of time. I'll keep things to the point. How much about this situation do you understand? Lionel didn't know how to respond to this question. He knew what Max was referring to, but how much of his assumption was correct, he didn't know. Also, this didn't seem like the kind of question this man should be asking him. He should have been on their side, no? Was he wrong about that? Everything the Suyard family did seemed to side with them, most pointedly of which was marrying Amory off to the spiritual's religion as though he was some damsel. Suddenly, Lionel's pupils constricted. What was he thinking? What a stupid mistake. He had already learned that these incomplete worlds were set up by the humans of a complete world in order to survive some sort of calamity. But he hadn't thought about something very important. If this place was created for humans, then what did that mean for the other races in these incomplete worlds? What would happen to them? Would they be seamlessly integrated? That sounded very unlikely. It was more likely that they would be pulled into slavery and forced into subordination, used for the purposes of the humans of the complete world, and then. Well, if the humans had as poor of a position in greater existence as Elryan and Shanrei had made it seem, then they would likely get rid of these pawns as quickly as possible so as not to attract the ire of species and races far more powerful than them. The spirituals of this incomplete world were already so powerful. What about the spirituals in greater existence? What about the Raypaks? Or the beasts? Or the nomads? And how would they react to knowing their race of people was forced into submission by the humans? Lionel only now realized just how much of a gamble this was. It wasn't just them gambling their future existence within these incomplete worlds, but if they dared to use the other races, even if they survived the first calamity, they might invite upon themselves countless more. He was so used to humans being in the weaker position that he had almost neglected the fact that in this small corner of existence, they were the ones in control, and as a result, the races that usually pinned them beneath their heels were in a precarious situation as well. Him assuming that the Suyard family was just like Shield Cross Stars or the Void Palace or the Three-Finger Cult, all because they had sided with the spiritual's religion was foolish. He had simply taken their being an enemy to be natural as they had always been the rival of the Morales, but he was only making false assumptions. He also wondered just how much of these deductions could be translated to the hidden branch of the Morales as well. I see. Lionel spoke his first words. Okay. Hand over your world spirit and give me information about your cooperation with the spirituals and I will handle the rest. Max Suyard didn't even know what to say. Chapter 2291. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 2291. Losers. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2291. Losers. Overlord Max had asked his question perfunctorily. He knew, or at least he thought he knew, that Lionel didn't know the truth of the situation. But in just a few seconds, he watched Lionel pause, ponder, and then respond as though he had just seen right through him. It was a feeling that he had never experienced before, not even from Ishmael. He truly didn't know how to respond because he was rendered speechless. He felt that he had underestimated this boy a bit too much. But he was still far too arrogant to. Lionel waved a hand, and Max felt an uncontrollable force pull at his heart. He didn't realize that by entering the starship alongside Lionel, he had already sealed the fate of his world spirit. There was no need for battle, no need for Lionel to find the location of their holy land, because what he wanted was right before him. Overlord Max's expression changed, and he reached forward with a deft swiftness, but it was too late. The world spirit landed in Lionel's palms, and he crushed it. In that instant, the Suyard family's world had been conquered, leaving much of the family stunned. Let alone them, even Max didn't really understand what had just happened. The Overlord probably should have been enraged, but he didn't even know what emotions he should be feeling in the first place. This brat. Max mumbled. Unlike the others, Max wasn't a fool. He could tell that for some ridiculous reason, the Morales had actually let Lionel hold on to their world spirit. Instead of fretting like the others did, if he really cared about the world spirit so much, then it would be as simple as killing Lionel and taking it. Of course, there were some problems with that choice too. For one, this brat seemed to be far too confident. But in Max's views, Lionel understood too little about his own strength. If it wasn't for the fact that he was less hot-headed than the Morales men, Velasco wouldn't be the only one they were all intent on killing. N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N But that matter couldn't really be blamed on Velasco honestly. In Max's opinion, this was the case of the son paying for the sins of the father, and it seemed that that cycle was trying to replay itself here. He couldn't help but sigh. This isn't a worthwhile path, Max suddenly said. Maybe it's hypocritical of me to say this because I'm not sure how I would react if I ever lost my wife, but hate me or not, I believe your grandfather was a fool. Your father after him was a fool. And now you're being a fool. Max hoped to see some anger in Lionel's eyes, some rage, but he saw nothing at all, and it was precisely that made him realize just how hopeless it was. Rage would imply some irrationality, some emotional instability, some lack of forethought or awareness toward the reality of the situation he was in. But the fact that Lionel showed nothing, and didn't show any signs of attacking him either, meant that he was of his right mind, and that only made it worse. All those years ago, your grandfather fell in love with the wrong woman. Honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that you have the Morales family lineage factor, I wouldn't even be able to say with any more than 10% assurance that you are your grandfather's grandson. In fact, even though you have the lineage factor, I still can't say it with any more than 50% assurance. I have no idea what that woman is capable of. He was arrogant, believing himself to be infallible, believing that it was only natural that such a woman would fall for him. And maybe had this woman been from this small world, it would have made sense. He was truly excellent for a person born to such disadvantages. I warned him many times, but he didn't listen. I had never known him to be a man infatuated by beauty, but you never know what a man is capable of when he falls in love. In the end, what was likely a childish game to her became a life and death situation for him. He offended those he shouldn't have, and turned far more attention to this world than he would have otherwise. Due to your grandfather's love for that woman, the last bastion of the Fox family was exposed, the cult entered this world, and Shield Cross Stars was infiltrated by another party. Right now, they've probably already taken control. In the end, he still didn't even blame her. He blamed himself, finally saying that he had overestimated himself, all for that worthless woman. Max seemed to become more and more enraged as he spoke, but in contrast, his voice became more subdued. It was instead the sword force in the air that crossed and echoed like sharpening blades. A woman can help a man to do great things. A woman can also destroy a man, and sometimes that can happen whether she's a good woman or not. Max looked at Lionel. The latter could feel the blood vessels in his whites popping one after another, causing a stream of blood to stream down his cheeks, but he still didn't look away. I don't know how many female powerhouses lie with random men and have children with them. I can't say whether she was one such person, if I've misunderstood her, or whether she's a spawn of Satan. What I can say is that there's a cycle you have the chance to stop so long as you will it, and I would advise that you take that chance. Silence fell. It was a long one that lasted upwards of 10 minutes as the two met each other's gazes, one indifferent, and the other bleeding tears of blood. All right, return my grandson to me, Max suddenly said. Lionel just waved a hand, and Amory appeared, looking just the same. Useless brat, Max scolded, slapping Amory with a palm to the forehead despite the distance between them. Amory, though, didn't react to this. Even after his grandfather stood and pulled him up by the scruff of his collar, he still didn't react. If you can win, I'll consider supporting you. But I don't invest in losers, Max said as he turned and left with Amory in tow. I would advise you to be careful, though. They've sent one more powerful than me. Chapter 2292. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 2292. A warning: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2292. A warning. Lionel didn't say anything even after Max had left, but his senses relaxed somewhat and his hold on his brothers loosened. The reason he had insisted on not closing his eyes when he faced Max's stare was because he didn't want to be distracted for even a moment. Against such a person, even a split moment of distraction would mean death, and if Lionel died, there would be no one to bring him back to life. He didn't miss any part of what Max had said, but that was less because he was listening for his advice, and more so because he was searching for clues about other matters. His grandfather's lover was one person that he needed to know more about. Usually, this would be a person he directly ignored, but she had crossed his bottom line. Since she wanted to stand opposing him, then she would have to die. Lionel didn't move immediately, though, even after the meeting had concluded. He had planned to spend quite some time on the Suyard family and he didn't quite know what it meant to let them go like this. Until now, he had simply taken the world's spirit and left. In his opinion, that was all that was necessary for the weaker families, at least relative to the other powerhouses of the seventh dimension. However, the Suyard family was different. They were a true powerhouse, and the blow they could deal Lionel if he was caught off guard was heavy, especially if Max took action. It was more difficult than not to leave them be like this. His finger had even twitched somewhat as he felt that killing Max here would be easier on him. He wouldn't have this constant lingering insecurity in the back of his mind. Letting him leave essentially barred some of the path he would have taken otherwise, but then again it opened up others. By now, everyone assumed that he would be attacking the Suyard family. This was a move that would definitely surprise them as the Morales and Suyard had been battling one another for so many years that they should know just how evenly matched they were. They were widely known as the two most powerful families in terms of pure combat, so starting with them might not seem to be the smartest thing to do. But now that they had, everyone would be expecting a battle that would rage on for days at the very least. Catching the off guard now would be even easier. However, the matter of who to catch off guard surprisingly stumped Lionel. Should he attack the spirituals' religion? But they were allies with the Suyards and now he was in a tentative relationship with the latter. Did it still make sense to attack them? But then again, while he might have some reason to think that the spirituals would stay on the sideline, what about the religion? Could Max sway them to not? If he didn't attack the spirituals' religion, then who should he attack? Shield Cross Stars? The Void Palace? It was difficult to choose. Lionel seemed aimless right now, but that was precisely because this situation was so baffling to him. Originally, he planned to cut the Suyards down in about a week or so. Although he had cut right to their capital, he expected a very difficult battle, and he also prepared contingencies for being attacked from the back. He knew that it would only be a matter of time before the rest of the Suyard family's forces caught up and joined the battle. In that time, he planned for his scouts to pay attention to the situation in the rest of the human domain and had at least 3 different maneuvers prepared for various situations. But now, Noviel B. in Lionel shook his head. He almost had half a mind to believe that Max had given up his world spirit on purpose just to catch Lionel off guard, because he had never thought that gaining an ally would confuse him like this. This isn't a normal sort of confusion, Lionel thought pensively. He had felt something like this before. Or rather, it was similar, but not exact. When he had first thought of the demoness, he could sense her gaze on him, and now he was feeling something similar. Someone could sense him thinking and was obstructing his vision. Despite this thought clearing things up for him, it made things even foggier. Lionel's gaze narrowed further. Then he remembered what Max had said. Someone even more powerful than him? Was this person powerful enough to know that Max had mentioned them? Because if they were, then the fact that Max had said anything at all could have alerted this person to what was happening here, and in the case they were alerted, that meant that any intentions he had of using a surprise attack had already failed. Lionel's confusion lifted and his gaze glowed. The Dream Pavilion. It seemed that whoever they had sent had the capability to use dream force on a far higher level than his own, and it was likely that any schemes or plans he had prepared would all be useless. But that also confirmed something else. Max was helping him. He didn't believe that someone as powerful as Max would mention this person without reason, and it couldn't possibly be such a foolish mistake on his part. He had mentioned it hoping that Lionel would pick up on the problem. Max was letting Lionel know that if he continued like this, he would fail, and he would fail miserably at that. The way that he had learned to wage war until now was playing around in a kiddie pool while the adults had been surging on raging tsunami-like waves for generations already. I see. This level of dream force is still out of my reach. Lionel tapped a finger on his arm rest, his gaze growing sharper and sharper. He needed a method to protect his mind. Unless he could succeed in finding such a method, the only path forward would be brute strength. And right now, he didn't have nearly enough strength to succeed with that method, not outside the bounds of Morales territory. Chapter 2293. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 2293, Dream Force and Star Force. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2293, Dream Force and Star Force. Lionel took a breath and closed his eyes, taking deep and slow breaths. He had spent all of this time completely focused on vital Star Force and hadn't spared time for his other force, but now it felt very necessary to do so. The trouble was that he didn't have a cheat this time like he had with his vital Star Force. Lionel was certain that the one who was obscuring his path forward was far weaker than that so-called grandmother of his. For one, his person was in this incomplete world with him, while the demoness most definitely was not. In addition, the demoness only allowed him to sense her out of sheer amusement. That was something else Lionel was certain about. If she didn't want him to know of her gaze, he wouldn't be able to sense a single thing. This was to say that while the manipulation of this person that was opposing him now felt far more subtle and he wouldn't have noticed if not for Max's hint, it wasn't impossibly beyond him, he was just ignorant. The most important thing he learned was that Dream Force could be used in this way. He fell into the trap of always thinking about Dream Force as an internal thing, and the fact that his ability index was designed the way it was made it even more difficult to break free of this thought. But it could be said that Dream Force was the most abundant force there was, or at the very least, it was among the top few, sharing the spot along with Neutral Force and Star Force. Where there was life, there was Dream Force. It underlied the very fabric of reality, and it was probably the very foundation of the second dimension, the same way. Star Force is the foundation of the third and higher dimensions. When Lionel first learned about Star Force, he didn't understand what it was. What did it mean for there to be Star Force? Light Force was straightforward enough, it was light. So was Dark Force. So was Earth Force or any other elemental force. Most forces made perfect sense to him, except for this one. Stars emitted light, so why wasn't it a kind of light force? Or, what about the heat they emitted? Why wasn't it a kind of fire force? Why was there a need for a distinct and separate category? And why was it that all of the most powerful forces seemed to have a foundation of Star Force within them? It was only after meeting El Ryan that it clicked for Lionel, and it was due to a single like the Pluto youth had spoken, N-O-V-E. LB/I-. Incomplete worlds have just a single star, a single land, only incomplete worlds are so scattered. It all made sense, and it was even more obvious by the fact the representation of existence itself was none other than a star, the Northern Star. Fire Force wasn't the representation of the spark of life like Lionel had thought. No, that was a Star Force. It was something even more fundamental than Fire Force, even more fundamental than Light Force as well. It was why there was no Star Force like there was Fire Force or Light Force. It was always accompanied by something else. And this wasn't because it was weak, but rather because it was the strongest. It was the very foundation of all that was. After the Big Bang, there was an endless soup of energy, and it was only when these soup of hot energy organized into stars that the planets that formed afterward could begin to teem with life. More accurately, without Star Force, there was no life force, and without Dream Force that came before it, there was no potential for Star Force to spark life in the first place. If Dream Force was even more fundamental than Star Force, which represented all things, then why was he treating it so separately? Why was he treating it like his mind was separate from everything else? His mind was just one kernel in a sea of kernels, and his Dream Force wasn't as separate as he thought it to be. Not being able to expel Dream Force out of his body didn't equate to it being separate, rather it just meant that his Dream Force didn't need to exhibit such skills to display its understanding of the wider world. If he took an extremist view, his dream force was just a borrowed strength from this world. Dream force was never separate, not at his level. Much like star force, it was always attached to others, always infused into a fabric that existed within the second dimension, the fabric of everything, the life state. His dream force rippled out and he stepped past the fourth layer and entered the impetus state. His thoughts seemed to enter a completely separate plane, and within it, he could sense countless swimming minds that seemed to immediately sense him and then attack. Lionel felt a shuddering pain and his nose began to bleed. He pulled his mind back as quickly as he could, but still fell to a knee, coughing up a mouthful of blood. Looking inwardly, he saw a hairline fracture run through his ethereal glabella that left his gaze burning. That plane, he didn't know what it was, not exactly, but he felt that it was all too similar to the shadow world of shadow sovereigns. He didn't think himself to be a shadow sovereign, or rather, a dream sovereign. But then again, wasn't this situation very similar? Little Blackstar wasn't exactly a shadow sovereign, but rather received it as an ability index. Madrid, however, was a true shadow sovereign, as her ability index and her shadow sovereign abilities were separate. Lionel was more like Little Blackstar, having an ability index that could tap into the abilities of a dream sovereign, but he seemed to have suffered for it. His burning gaze became surprisingly cold and the temperature in the surroundings plummeted. He took a breath and a large amount of dream force from the surroundings flooded into him. And then, his scarlet star force stars began to rotate with a pulsing vibrancy, and as his ethereal glabella was coated with destruction runes. He wasn't a dream sovereign, but he was a destruction sovereign. He wanted them to dare to destroy his soul again, he would crush them. Without hesitation, Lionel entered the dream world again. Author's note: just 2 chapters today, everyone, and no chapters tomorrow, unfortunately. Chapter 2294. Published at 8th of November 2023, 6:56 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 2294. Shortcut: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2294. Shortcut: this time when Lionel re-entered the odd plane, he came in like a blazing inferno. He could easily remember the energy signatures of all those that had attacked him previously. It might as well have been like looking at a face for him. But he realized almost instantly that those people were no longer around him. He realized what the issue was soon. The movement in this odd plane was incredibly fast, but it was also a great deal restrained. The further he traveled, the greater burden he felt on his dream force reserves, as though his soul itself was being stretched thin. The more soul he had, the further it would be able to go from his current location, but if he moved too recklessly, he could find himself having killed himself before any of these people could get around to him. However, what Lionel learned immediately after that was that it didn't seem to matter who was around him at all, or more accurately, he hadn't landed in the midst of a particularly sinister bunch. It instead seemed that everyone in this plane was a complete jerk. He had only appeared for a few fractions of a second before he took everything in, and yet the new group of individuals around him had attacked without hesitation again. It was as though they all had a keen sense for fresh meat and they wanted at Lionel immediately. But this time, they paid the price for it. The destruction runes lit up, and a raging, violent aura shredded everything in its path. Sovereign. It felt like someone had roared this into his ears, and yet it felt instead like it had echoed out from his very skull. It was an odd and disorienting feeling, the kind that almost made him think that this was some sort of soul attack instead of what it actually was. But more importantly than that, he was shocked. Someone had pinged him as a sovereign immediately, but they didn't really say what kind. That was interesting enough that Lionel felt that he could make some extrapolations from it. In fact, Lionel believed that it might be the case that the only method of using a force outside of dream force in this plane was to be a sovereign. If that's the case. Lionel tried to think in a more solidified way instead of the quick pictures and images he usually thought in. But the instant he did, his voice came out like a roar, even louder than the various souls around him. His reaction was quick, and he stopped immediately, but the damage of doing so was even more devastating than his destruction runes had been. His voice blasted the surrounding souls away, and their dream force dimmed considerably. Some of them even became motes of light, floating into him. Lionel was stunned. He hadn't experienced this feeling since the last time he had killed an invalid, so it had been quite a long time. The more he integrated into the wider dimensional verse, the less invalids there seemed to be, but this made sense. The powerful families that had managed to survive would have long since gotten rid of the invalids that threatened them. As for variant invalids, well, the last time he had come across one was in the Rapak's nest, so they should be part of the cult, but since then there had been nothing at all. But why was this feeling so similar? He could even feel that his dream force had gotten not a small boost either. It seemed that whoever he had absorbed was quite decent. But what was even more shocking than that? Their memories? Lionel was rendered speechless once again as his voice roared out again. Just what kind of place was this? He could kill souls to increase his strength, and he gained their memories on top of that? The shadow world of the Shadow Sovereigns worked similarly, but it didn't directly increase their strength. From his understanding, as they defeated other Shadow Sovereigns, their shadow world became larger and their ability index became stronger as well, but it wasn't a direct addition to their strength, at least not like this. Is there a destruction plane like this dream plane? Or was this a unique thing? If this was something all sovereigns had, then Aina would have found her own long ago, but she hadn't. Lionel felt like he was sitting on the edge of something big, but he couldn't quite understand it. He chose to immediately go through and organize the memories he had gotten. He had just killed what should be 7 people, and they were a jumbled mess of collected thoughts and feelings. He created a new dream ability on the spot and called it Dream Filter. He organized their memories into dreamscapes first, and then used Dream Filter to pour out everything that was useless. He wouldn't waste his time on the thoughts and emotions of these people. What he needed was information, very specific information about what plane he had just tapped into. Dream plane. Lionel got his information with a great deal of swiftness, and the more he assimilated, the higher his brows arched. He had long since left the plane and was still sitting within his starship. The dream plane was a world that anyone who had entered the impetus state could access. It was a fold of reality and represented the second dimension, and within it, at least in certain locations, it was practically a free-for-all. NOVLB, 1N Lionel was only in a corner taken over by incomplete worlds. It was known as the incomplete wilds, and often experts of lesser worlds gathered there for quick power-ups because it was their only option. If they stepped into the lands of the complete worlds, they would be shredded to pieces. This wasn't because they were far weaker. It could be said that anyone who had entered the impetus state was a powerhouse. The problem was the suppression and the rules, though there was one more thing. Absorbing the strength of others, looking for quick shortcuts, had crippled many of them. Chapter 2295. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 2295. Obscure. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2295. Obscure. Crippled. It was something he probably wouldn't have thought of if not for these memories, but he was happy that he had. His dream force was the best ability he had. If he lost it, his combat effectiveness would take a huge plummet downward. In reality, though, it wasn't that his dream force would become weaker. It would grow stronger, to a point. But after that point was reached, instead of growing stronger, it would instead grow faster. He would gain access to a larger pool of dream force, but the amount he could use in a single sitting, and the amount that could output in a single moment would remain the same. It would be like restricting the funnel of his body, but this funnel would be toward the outside world. He wouldn't grow any smarter or sharper, and his ability index wouldn't increase either. To make a complicated matter simple, he would be stuck in the lower impetus state for the rest of his life. Interestingly enough, there wasn't a known reason for why this was, or more accurately, the memories of those he had absorbed had no real idea. It was hard to tell if this was because they were too ill-informed, or if it was the case that everyone was in the dark. That said, there were a few theories, the best of which stood out to Lionel because it sounded like something Elryan had warned him about. But interestingly enough, what Elryan had said back then was related to innate nodes and not this matter, but Lionel's dreamscape sparked with lightning and linked them. Taking on the strength of so many people would weigh down his ability to progress into the future, would hinder you far more than it would help you. You might benefit in the short term, but going into the future, you would find yourself weighed down by chains you didn't even know you were carrying. Even though he had learned of this, Lionel felt fascinated by the plane. The idea of being able to steal the memory of others and assimilate all of their thoughts was more intriguing than he ever thought it could be. Just a single soul absorption had been enough to heal the crack on his ethereal labella, and the remaining few had made him feel like he was already on the verge of breaking through again. It was an intoxicating feeling, and he realized why those of the incomplete worlds took this path. They couldn't progress anymore due to the cap of their worlds anyway, so why not search for other methods of strengthening themselves? Why should they resign themselves to being weak? Lionel frowned. It had a strong pull for himself as well, but he likewise didn't want to cripple his future. He was willing to do it for Aina, but quite frankly, when it came to his dream force, he was supremely confident in himself. Just a small clue from Max had allowed him the ability to enter the impetus state. If he had had this much affinity with vital star force, he would have already taken that final step. Unfortunately, he didn't. He shook his head and focused. First, he would go through the rest of the memories to see if there was anything useful. Once he was done, he could begin investigating just how that hidden expert was confusing him. He finished the first quickly, and he learned a great many things. One of the 7 he had killed came from an incomplete world that Lionel believed was better than 70% likely to be among the several dozen under the control of the vast bubble. In addition, this person was actually aware of their state as well. This wasn't surprising to Lionel. After the spear domain trial, he realized that the other incomplete worlds that had become part of this simulation had unearthed their plight as well and were preparing for the other shoe to drop. That made Lionel wonder if the domain rings were dropped into this world for that specific purpose. Was it the design of the Dream Pavilion? Or, maybe, it was the intention of the Fox family? He wasn't sure. Either way, this man came from a family that had an axe domain ring, and he had an illusion-type ability index. Lionel was less interested in the domain rings these days as he felt that forming a weapon sovereignty on your own was much better. The rings were just glorified storage rings that only housed one type of weapon in his eyes. Even the spears weren't as attractive. Of course, there was one more thing the rings were good for, and that was their lineage factors. If he came across an axe domain ring, he would be certain to try and get it for Aina. The Raider family. He took mental note of this. This was only a side project for Lionel though. When it came to these memories, what he focused most on was the unique insights these men had toward the dream plane and their use of dream force. It turned out that these 7 only really used the dream plane to hunt. It was too risky to go after veterans, so they waited around for newbies like Lionel before taking action. Using the more complex functions of the dream plane took more effort and could be more dangerous depending on the situation. The dream plane was something that linked all beings across the cosmos whether they were aware of it or not. Much like how everyone had a shadow, but not everyone could access the shadow world. In incomplete worlds, the dream plane would have various weaknesses. Usually, one could only enter the dream plane after forming a life-state dream force, or by being a dream sovereign. However, in an incomplete world, you could do it from the impetus state, and it also gave you great control and pull in your world. You could use it to spy on the thoughts of others and read their intentions ahead of time, reading their thoughts and memories while they were unaware. Or you could obscure their vision and make their thoughts muddled and confused. Novi Lbn. Chapter 2296. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 2296. Ignorant if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2296. Ignorant Lionel's dream force affinity was far too high. Even if one hadn't gained access to the dream plane yet, having high affinity would allow you to sense its pull even while unawares. Due to this, whoever was trying to mess with him had to be extremely subtle and couldn't just dig through his thoughts and memories as they pleased. Of course, you could avoid this sort of probing in other ways as well. One way was through the use of mind-protecting treasures, something that was far more common in complete worlds. In addition, you could avoid this by just being extremely powerful yourself and having a force within the life state. Having a life state force made you more sensitive to the matters occurring in the second dimension, and you could fight against them. That way, even without protective treasures, you could be immune to the probes of a dream force master. Of course, only those with crafters of a certain caliber could hope to have such protective treasures. The likes of the void bubble had to buy such treasures from other bubbles, and since they had been cut off from the wider world for so long, they had very few remaining, and they were concentrated in the hands of the most elite. That said, since Lionel wasn't in the life state yet and was only in the lower impetus state, he was very far away from being able to affect the dream plane of a complete world, even if it was a weak one. Even so, this sort of understanding blew everything he had come to know out of the water. What was more important than that was that his own mind wasn't the only thing he had to worry about, there was also the minds of everyone else. Luckily, Lionel hated explaining himself and usually kept his plans to himself aside from a few irrelevant tidbits. This weakened the possibility of others probing those around him for information considerably. A thought flashed in the back of Lionel's mind. Was this the influence of his future self again? Had he been aware of the pitfalls and grown to keep his thoughts within the only mind he could protect? Lionel shook his head. He wasn't going to think about that person. You didn't need to give me that clue, I would have figured it out on my own. But this was indeed faster. Due to the demoness, Lionel was already familiar with this kind of probing. The moment he sensed the confusion in his mind, the odd, contradictory sort of confusion, the kind he had never experienced before, he would have realized that he was missing something. Whoever was trying to mess with him had underestimated the level of confidence he had in himself. The question now was, how would he counter? He understood how to after reading the memories of 7 experts. Each one of them had their own unique theories on how to manipulate dream force, and in an objective kind of way, each one was the pioneer of their own unique fields. Being raised in an incomplete world and making it to the impetus state on their own made each one of the geniuses. Had they been born in complete worlds, they would have been high-class experts without a doubt, and that sort of unique insight was invaluable. If not for the dangers of absorbing too much, he would have wanted to take more advantage of this. There were clearly some unique paths in incomplete worlds that complete worlds hadn't thought of yet. There wasn't a gap in intelligence between the worlds, but rather a gap in time and resources. There might very well be some unique magic system or style or force manipulation method that existed in an incomplete world that existence couldn't even fathom. Lionel sat in silence for a long while, tapping his finger on his armrest. I don't know who you are. But you just made this war 100 times easier for me. I'll thank you with a swift loss. Lionel's mind reached out into the second dimension, taking advantage of the weakness of his incomplete world. Then, he began to send messages to each one of his people. They wanted to find a chink in his armor, right? Well, find a way. After he was done, he stood. Countless galaxies away, a middle-aged woman with flowing blue hair snapped awake from her meditation. Anyone of the Shield Cross Stars organization would recognize her as Cross Elder Vega. Her blue eyes glowed radiantly for a moment before she calmed down. She closed her eyes once more, then double-checked, and then triple-checked. This method of dream force manipulation is so crude. Whoever this is only recently came into contact with the dream plane and their strength is weak. An early impetus state expert. Using an array of commands to try and confuse my sight? Vega slowly shook her head. It was meaningless. In this world, there was no existence with dream force manipulation better than her own. She had felt Max warn Lionel the moment he mentioned her in passing. This wasn't because she was as sharp as the demoness, but rather because there were certain minds she always paid attention to, and the overlords of this world were all on that list. That list, though, had an odd entry that stood out as the only seventh-dimensional existence on it, and that was Lionel Morales, and it seemed it had done her good. That boy used a single offhand and subtle clue to grasp the secret of the dream plane, and now he was actually trying to use it against her. This sort of seedling was exactly the kind the dream pavilion would fawn over. Not even 30 years old and yet had entered the impetus state and touched upon the dream plane. There were only 2 on par with him in the entire younger generation of the vast bubble, N/0 and unfortunately, he had made the wrong choice. Vega waved a hand and several protective talismans appeared. Lionel had learned from the memories of the seven that protective treasures existed. What he hadn't learned was that there were other methods of protection, and one of them was a direct shroud by another expert who could enter the dream plane. Toying with an ignorant boy was child's play. Chapter 2297. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:56 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 2297. Extremely so. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2297. Extremely so. The human domain's forces began to move around like pieces on a chessboard. A complex and intertwined network, layered in the push and pull of politics, relationships, and benefits, bent and twisted, all of them converging toward the spiritual's religion. Lionel sat silently in the cockpit of one of his many starships, his gaze somewhat lazy and his focus trained on the endless sea of stars before him. His fleet continued to move with great speed, reading and reacting to his organs as they slithered by one outpost after another. He didn't seem to feel the sense of looming danger that he should have, his expression as cool as a frigid lake. Soon, he had made it into the airspace of the spiritual's religion, and the location could only be said to be bright and beautiful. The planets ahead all had gorgeous planetary rings that looked like angelic halos, as though the asteroids had been dusted with gold eons ago when they had taken shape. However, there was a keen sense of danger hidden within that beauty, countless force arts hidden within. The spiritual's religion was ready, and their force arts were the strongest that Lionel had ever seen within the human domain. Even the strongholds of the Morales didn't have such grand force arts or protective arrays. The Morales might be crafters, but that didn't translate to all skills. There was quite some difference between crafting treasure, concocting force pills, and drawing large-scale protective force arts. The Morales shared the title of best for the first with the Omen family. The Omen family was practically a lone wolf when it came to the second as far as he was aware, and as for the very last, he hadn't known of anyone who was truly a master of this craft. Until now. Lionel didn't place the large-scale force arts of the starships in the same category, honestly. Although many of them were truly large, they relied on crafting as a foundation, and it was the strength of the treasure, not the force art itself, that gave it its strength. That was different from a force art that could be used to protect a planet, or even a chain of planets like this one. Unless, of course, one wanted to replace their planet with a forged treasure. There were many reasons this wasn't done, though, the leading of which being the fact that starships required too much power to use even on occasion, let alone as a permanent living arrangement. It was much smarter to rely on the resources of the wider world to provide you with what you needed. And it was precisely because of that the Morales didn't have such high attainments in this sort of art. Crafting treasures required taking control of the elements and bending them to your will. This was even more so for the life grade, where you were practically giving birth to an item with its own sense of existence, at least in a more philosophical and tangential way. However, these large-scale force arts required working with the elements, not bending their will but rather understanding them and then working together to mold them along a particular path. This was the feeling that Ryu got when he saw natural force arts, and it was why just meditating upon them allowed one to feel and experience auspicious air. This was the beauty of listening to the insights of nature. And who could be better at that than the spirituals? Interesting. Lionel thought to himself. One of the 7 minds that he had absorbed had some insights into this matter. He might have thought of it himself after seeing this scene, but knowing it ahead of time made him feel enlightened, as though he had truly come to understand it himself. There was no ability that could make one better at understanding the insights of nature than being able to enter the dream plane. His real sight could see the majesty of the formations before him, he could feel their power. He still had the partial and incomplete Biyao domain lineage factor, and even from so far away, he could lay eyes on it himself as though he was right in its midst. His dream sight, or what he had chosen to call it, could see the complex swirls of runes that swam among them. Usually these runes were in a jumbled mess, exposing the more erratic nature of the world and existence, but under the care and attention of the spirituals, they had to line up perfect, fitting into one another like the pieces of a puzzle or countless tiny dots spaced and shaded so perfectly that when one zoomed out, only a masterpiece remained. It was truly gorgeous in a way that Lionel had never seen before, and the feeling of being able to see the world in this way made him smile involuntarily, his cool expression giving way to a gentleness. He wished he had been able to see the world like this long ago. NOVL1N, go back from whence you came. The voice was gentle, but firm, and it carried a power that made Lionel's heart skip a beat. He couldn't help but wonder just how many hidden powerhouses of this level there were in the human domain. First there was that man in the pious family, then there was Max of the Suyard family, and now there was this older woman who still managed to exhibit the air of a supreme beauty. Even though she was getting on in years, Lionel wouldn't be surprised if there were several young men who would be willing to fall at her skirt even to this day. Her hair was a dazzling arrow of pink and lavender, her eyes matching the hues. Her skin carried slight wrinkles here and there, but they were often interrupted by patches of beautiful, smooth flesh that was no less elastic than a 20-year-old's. Her figure was hidden beneath a modest robe, but her exposed hands carried not the slightest hint of age, and it made one feel that whatever was underneath was just as well maintained. But more important than all of that, she was powerful. Extremely so. Chapter 2298. Published at 8th of November 2023, 6:55 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 2298. Devastating if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2298. Devastating. Lionel didn't respond. Or rather, he didn't respond with his words. 3 laser beams shot out at once, their speed so great that the echo of the older woman's voice hadn't even faded before they appeared around her, pincering her in from all directions. The half-spiritual overlord was taken off guard. She had been ready for the strikes, and she had been perfectly ready to dodge using a method not too dissimilar from Max's efforts earlier. But seeing them coming, and barely registering their speed at that, she realized that all of her efforts at dodging would be in vain. All of the angles she could use were cut off. Or more accurately, the ones that she could use with great enough speed were. Her gaze turned serious, and a pendant on her chest danced as though a rush of wind had just passed by. The rising winds of force echoed across the chain of ringed planets as the force art lit up, an overwhelming strength descending and forming a shield around the woman. Bang! 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 The shield of force shuddered for only a brief moment. It showed no hints of cracking, and it was sturdy to the point that even if Lionel concentrated the beams any more than he already had, it wouldn't make much of a difference at all. The spiritual's religion had managed to gather strength beyond that of the Tier 2 modified starships, and even the strongest Tier 1 starships in their home. In the whole of the human domain, they might truly have the most impenetrable walls. The half-spiritual overlord took a step forward, and her hands caused the arrays around her to light up. The runes that were once invisible to the naked eye, only displayed before Lionel when he used the vision of the dream plane, solidified and became corporeal. She looked gorgeous as she stepped forward, the laws of the world rotating around her like a second flowing dress. This time, she struck out with a palm, and the energies of the world seemed to resonate, forming a half-dozen palms that descended from the skies above. Boom! 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 Lionel could only watch as his starships were crushed to pieces, killing the several million on board. He had modified the starships personally. Their defenses and their attack strength was only marginally weaker than a full-fledged Tier 1 starship. But they had been crushed like tissue paper, leaving no chance for those on board. His expression became cold. He managed to follow the pathways of the descending palms and moved his starship out of the way, but he was only fast enough to calculate one trajectory and dodging path. While it was the case that entering the dream plane was a great boon to his senses, it also occupied much more of his mind's, and the effort in making use of his advantage in thinking speed was also strained. He needed to form a better balance, one between the quantity of thought and another for quality. At the same time, he also came to understand that the strongest beings of existence probably didn't just endlessly increase their number of split minds. They would gain access to the dream plane as well, and they would likely begin to tend toward quality as well. He still remembered that lesson Y Star Order had taught him when they first met. Y Star Order only had one mind, but Lionel already had thousands back then. He thought that he could hide his thoughts from Y Star Order by jumbling up his minds and hiding his intentions in only one, but Y Star Order had blown him out of the water. His one mind back then was worth far more than thousands of Lionel's because the quality of his one was impossibly far beyond Lionel's at the time. He couldn't help but wonder if Wise Star Order had touched upon the dream plane as well, but now wasn't the time to think about such things. This was the greatest loss he had suffered since his campaign had begun, and he couldn't take it lying down. He gave over 90% of his minds over to the dream plane, reading and analyzing everything happening in his surroundings. There was no longer a need to deploy his dream world because it was completely and wholly inferior to what access to the dream plane gave him. He needed to grasp the strengths and weaknesses of the force art ahead, target the latter, and avoid the former. Then, he needed to find an opportunity to shatter it. The segmented cube was quickly deployed, and its various jigsaw puzzles fanned out and enveloped the starship. Then, the starship began to rapidly shrink, from a few kilometers in diameter to no more than a few meters. This was a trump card he hadn't used just yet. The segmented cube wasn't a fortress, and it couldn't be used to attack either. But that didn't mean that he couldn't use Anastasia to integrate into his other creations, fusing the benefits of both into one. Novi/LB in one of Anastasia's fundamental abilities, and one that he often neglected because of how much of an open secret it was the ability to take large items and put them into a very small space. So why not use that for his starship? Suddenly, the speed of the starship blazed, and it became even faster. Lionel took manual control and whizzed by the attacks of the Overlord, inching closer until he suddenly vanished, appearing to her back. A second one of Anastasia's fundamental abilities was control over time. Whether it was the suspended reality of the snow globes, the dilated inner world of the incubators, or even her ability to peer through the stream of time and even pluck out lives to resurrect, all of them relied on time force and spatial force. Together, they were devastating. Lionel shot through a weak point of the force art like a speeding light beam of his own. It was so fast that the Overlord couldn't even react, the long-standing force art of the spiritual religion crumbling right before their eyes. Chapter 2299. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:55 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 2299. Snapped if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2299. Snapped. The surroundings seemed to explode with gold dust particles. As though a child had gone too crazy with their arts and crafts project, the depths of space was dyed with a sparkling tapestry. It was a gorgeous sight, unless you were a half-spiritual, in which case it was probably the most devastating conclusion. The fate of other races in the human domain wasn't always horrible, but it wasn't necessarily great either. And despite the words of Locke of the Suyard family, those spirituals that impregnated humans didn't usually care for their families very much. Though the term half-spiritual was used, the reality was that most of those that were left behind in the human domain weren't even a quarter spiritual. However, they managed to hold on to most of the power and were quite talented anyway, displaying the kind of strength spiritual bloodlines had, though Lionel had another guess for this. In his opinion, there was probably some strong staying power in terms of the gene of the spirituals that allowed the soul to be born separate from the body. As a result, even when the lineage had long diverged from the original spiritual that had birthed it, the spirituals, or rather half-spirituals, born later still gained almost the same benefits as the original half-spiritual in their line. This, however, wasn't what was important now. To form a power, especially one this strong, while having strong ties to another race was a very daunting task. To stand where they stood today, the half-spirituals of the human domain had faced all sorts of adversity and their current strength didn't paint an accurate picture of where they had come from. This was the reality of most other races that were a minority in the domain they lived in. The spirituals' religion just happened to be a success story in what was likely a sea of failures. This was all to say that the force art that protected these lands was more important to the spirituals than just the strength it provided. It was security, it was autonomy, it represented to them the hope to make their own choices and lead their own lives. And now it was gone. Off on a distant ship, Yuri stood in silence. She too was a half-spiritual, and she didn't know much about her family at all. For all she knew, someone here was her parent, not that it mattered much. The only family she cared for now was Aina and her stepfather. Well, maybe she should include that big, lumbering brute too. It was funny, though. She hadn't seen Aina in what felt like years, still not knowing what had happened to her sister. Her stepfather was just as absent. And now that big brute was off fighting with that annoying man up ahead. Yuri shook her head, not quite understanding why she was feeling like this right now. It was more embarrassing than anything else. The fate of the human domain was on the line, and this was what she was thinking about. It's cruel, isn't it, what he's doing to your people, N/0 Velby, and Yuri subconsciously nodded. Lionel really was too cruel. He didn't used to be like this. In the past, he was so compassionate, too compassionate. She had known that he carried a hidden sharpness within him, and had been hesitant about her sister falling for him as a result, but she had never thought that it would be so dark, so sinister. As a half-spiritual, she was quite sensitive to such things. As good as Lionel was at reading people, she was quite good as well, and her soul force affinity was exceptionally high. Looking toward Lionel's back in the far-off distance, he just felt like a shroud of evil, wrapped in the cloak of a black dragon of sorts and carrying all of the creature's worst vices. Wrath. Greed. Pride. He was the worst kind of leader. His charisma worked well on those he had been manipulating for a very long time, and it even worked well on those who were hyper-intelligent but lacked the sharpness of EQ. But to a person who could read him like she could, he was just a blob of insecurity, of aimless fury, of malice. She was quite powerful by now, no less talented than either James or that Blade girl who turned out to be a spark, or she guessed both of them were sparks now. But Lionel never used her. He was quite vengeful. Only because she had treated him a little coolly almost a decade ago now, he never allowed her into the spotlight, never allowed her to help protect the only family she had left, never allowed her to display her strength. The big brute told her that Lionel only made use of people he trusted, and that being used by him was actually a sign of respect and nothing less, but that just made her lip upturn into a sneer. Raj had been manipulated by that man for too long. Since when was being used a sign of respect? Since when was it a sign of trust? But she had grown tired of the argument. She realized that she truly did love Raj. She didn't like seeing the pain in his eyes every time she said something cruel about Lionel. Plus, if not for Lionel, that big brute would be dead, not just once, but twice over. Yuri seemed to calm down from the odd voice in her subconscious pokes and prods. She did carry some animosity toward Lionel, but not enough to truly hate him. At worst, they were just on opposing sides and could learn to live with one another. Plus, he had begun to use her now, right? Maybe this was a turn for the better. She looked down at the controls before her. It should be about her turn to act now, right? 3. She counted, 2. How could she not take part in such an important mission? Where do you think she could be? Something within Yuri snapped. Aina is dead. Chapter 2300. Published at 8th of November 2023 6:55 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 2300. In the eye, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2300. In the eye, a sharp pang cut into Yuri's heart. Somehow, she inwardly knew that these words were the truth. Her sister had died, and that bastard couldn't even take the time to look her in the eye and tell her that he had failed to protect her. N/0 Velby. In her eyes brimmed with tears, her chest felt like it was being ripped apart, and her blood felt like molten metal in her veins, pulsing about and making her organs feel as though they were being seared from the inside out. And yet, that feeling was only a reprieve from the heart-hollowing pain. What was he doing? Couldn't he resurrect everyone else easily? Why hadn't he resurrected Aina? Was he truly that cruel? Yuri grit her teeth so hard she felt as though her jaws alone might shatter this rattling mortal of hers. The cruelty this man was capable of was beyond her expectations. Or was it? This was exactly what she should expect from him. She could still remember those callous eyes. She had known how Lionel would respond to Aina's outpouring before anyone else had. She could feel the darkness within him. That day, on planet Luxnix, when the selection was taking place and Lionel was slotted to battle Aina, she had never expected that Aina would do such a thing, or else she would have done everything in her power to stop her. In the past, she had never made an effort to stop Lionel's attempts at wooing Aina because she felt that they were people from two different worlds. One was a quarterback, and the other was a 5-star health profession. One had a father born to a world that the other couldn't imagine, and the other was a normal human boy who couldn't even live on the surface. One was a talent destined to bring the Brazinger family to their knees, and the other couldn't even fathom what a family like the Brazinger family was capable of. In her views, he might even become an invalid the moment the metamorphosis descended, and it wouldn't be something to even worry about. But even when he didn't become an invalid, his reaction at seeing Aina kill was all she needed to see. Aina was too focused on revenge for her mother, and there wasn't time to care for all of these other things, especially not the coddling of the feelings of a grown man. However, as time passed, she slipped further and further away, and the feelings of a high school crush she thought would fade with time instead became stronger. It all culminated in that day when Aina told that man the truth, poured out her heart to him, described every secret little moment that she had kept to herself until that moment, secrets that she hadn't even told her own sister. And how had that man responded? So what? Those were his exact words. She could see it coming. She wanted to scream out for Aina to stop, to save those feelings for someone who was worthy, and yet it was already too late. She had to stand there and watch as her sister's heart crumbled to ashes. And then, she watched as that night, she gathered herself up, cleaned away her tears, and put on a dress she didn't even like to wear, just to go and support the man who had ripped her heart out the very next day. Yuri didn't have words for how furious that made her, didn't have the capacity to express exactly how filled with rage and fury she was. She wanted him to die, she wanted his body to be ripped limb from limb, for him to withstand unimaginable torment and spend the rest of his wretched life kneeling before the grave of her sister. The thoughts steamrolled as she imagined what could have happened to Aina. Why would she not be alive if the man had the capability? What cruelty had she experienced? Could he have lashed out at her in rage due to that father of his? Could they have gotten into another argument and he once again cut her off, not worrying for her life and death? What kind of torture had she experienced at his hands? The wild thoughts just kept churning and churning until her entire body seemed to emit a dense, black fog, the forces in her vicinity turning over with an almost solid darkness. Lionel breathed heavily. In order to deal with an existence on the level of this overlord, he had to lean on the dream plane to be able to read and react to her movements, but doing so while keeping a portion of himself lucid drained even his vast stores of dream force quickly. The moment he had shattered the large-scale force art, he had felt a wave of fatigue collide into him like a truck. But he had to withstand the assault of the spirituals right afterward. The segmented cube in this state was an excellent force art destroyer, but its defenses still weren't any better. Having thrown himself into the thick of battle, and within the time to reverse knowing that the overlord was already upon him, he had no choice but to stand out and take action himself, pulling on the strength of Raj and the others. Now, he had to fight while protecting the segmented cube to his back. Although it would be easier to turn it back into a treasure he could wear as a finger sleeve like he usually did, if he did that he would be cut off from the strength of his squadron of 10, and by then, he would find himself dying in a single strike to this enraged overlord. But Lionel wasn't a fool, he had prepared for this exact thing. With the overlord occupied dealing with him, the rest of the spirituals, or rather half-spirituals, were vulnerable. He didn't like relying on Yuri, but she was the only one under his command with the sensory capacity to do this. In addition, as a half-spiritual he had yet to be exposed to be under his command. When she acted, the spiritual's religion wouldn't even see him coming. Lionel's ear twitched and he sneered inwardly. Here it came. A beam shot over from the distance, and in the next instant, the confident Lionel froze. He looked down at his chest, a blood hole the size of a bowl having formed. Chapter 2301. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 2301. Heartless monster. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2301. Heartless monster. A rush of silence shot through the surroundings, even the half-spiritual overlord was stunned. That blast hadn't come from one of her people. Their defenses were extremely powerful, but their offenses could only be directed under the hands of a master. This was one of the weaknesses of such large-scale natural formations. However, she was the only one who could control enough of the formation to threaten Lionel's life, and only one person could use the formation at a time on top of that. And since she most definitely hadn't taken action, then NOVELBI/N she already knew what the answer was. Someone on Lionel's side had actually betrayed him. Despite the situation, she was too stunned to speak, and happiness wasn't her immediate emotion. There was something sad about seeing a genius like this fall. Even during this battle she had mostly wanted to capture Lionel and deal with him. She had some inkling about the kind of trouble that was coming over the horizon, and people like Lionel were the kind they needed. It was just that his edge was far too sharp. But now, she looked at the hole that had gone through Lionel's chest and watched as his life began to fade. Even after several moments, she didn't know what to do, and because she hadn't done anything, the other half-spirituals didn't do anything either. Of course, they didn't feel the same way as their overlord did, they only didn't move out of respect for her. If it was up to them, maybe they would have acted to cut Lionel's corpse into bloody ribbons just to make sure that he really was dead. Despite the fact Lionel was now gone, he had left them vulnerable. His death didn't even feel worth it. Just how much effort had they put into making it to this point? And now the formation their ancestors had put their blood, sweat, and tears into was no more. Would they even have the same standing in the human domain any longer? What about when the other races recovered and began their attack once more? The more they thought about it, the more enraged they were at the dead Lionel. They felt that his death had been too easy. Plus, a man who would be betrayed by his own people had a character that spoke for itself. If he could be cut down at such a time, how could he have been a good, noble leader? Whether it was he or his father, neither were good people. Within the Morales army, the shock was palpable. They had gotten used to Lionel being infallible, they had gotten used to being infallible themselves as well. Even after so many died under the attacks of the Overlord, they felt nothing. After all, Lionel would just resurrect them later and everything would be fine, just like before. But now that Lionel was dead, didn't that mean that all their comrades were dead as well? And what about the future of the Morales? This was a patriarch that had accomplished so much in a short time. Was his life really going to be cut short like this? Was that you? In a corner, hushed voices spoke. No, I didn't take action. That kid practically has 1,000 eyes. It feels like nothing escapes his vision. I wouldn't try to use such a simple ploy to deal with him. But maybe I just overestimated him. Then who? The two looked toward a region. The beams were too fast, and they were all focused on the battle. Only the starships in the immediate vicinity would know exactly which starship had fired, and it wouldn't be long before they reacted. As expected, after a brief pause, the starships in the vicinity all backed away and aimed their cannons toward the same exact location. There was no doubt who had taken action now. It's her. According to our intelligence, isn't she the sister of the first Nova's woman? How could she be the one to betray him? They had all made the same assumption. It only made sense that Lionel had given such an important task to this person. He was aware that there were hidden means within the Morales family that hadn't exposed themselves to him just yet, so he would only trust those closest to him to act as he wanted them to. But now, Yuri gripped the controls, her fury still boiling. In fact, she was furious that she could only kill Lionel like this. He deserved much worse, far worse. However, just as she was thinking this, the skies crackled and boomed, countless shimmering blue shields the size of planets appearing around the two armies. Shield cross stars had appeared, and even several of their cross elders had as well. It was clear what their goal was. In order to jump so far through space and appear so immediately, it would have cost a significant amount of energy remaining in the fusion cores of their starships, upwards of at least 10%, which was worth years of function. There was only one reason they would make such a big move. They wanted to deal a devastating blow to the Morales. The half-spiritual overlord frowned. She didn't believe for a single moment that they would dare to act so boldly in her territory if their formation hadn't crumbled. In fact, such a large jump through space wouldn't have even worked without it. She sent a gaze toward Lionel's corpse. Even dead, this boy was causing her so many problems. The spiritual's religion was its own thorn in the eyes of the cult and shield cross stars. It was a link between the spirituals and the human race that many weren't aware of, but these powers definitely would be. It seemed that the calamity of her spiritual's religion hadn't come to an end just yet. Overlord Vega stood at the helm of a Tier 1 starship. She was ready for any contingency plans the Morales might have. She didn't believe that they would send a junior to handle all of their problems like this. The ancestors were probably just a thought away, and truthfully, she hoped they would appear. That would help her to deal with all of these problems in a single sweep. The Morales, as presently constructed, didn't need to exist. Their constellation, however, that was far more interesting. As for the spiritual religion, she knew of their connection to the Suyard family, and she knew that there was another hand making moves in the shadows. It was best if they were crippled as well. She had to thank Lionel for making things so easy on her. "You're welcome." A voice suddenly echoed in her mind that made her freeze. Lionel's corpse suddenly gripped its fist and the sparkling streams of golden dust stopped dispersing into the depths of space and formed a barrier that solidified around the entire battlefield, trapping shield cross stars within. Overlord Vega immediately tried to activate the mass teleportation of the starships, reacting more quickly than even more ancestors should be capable of, but it was useless. Once again, the spatial lock on the region had returned and they were trapped. The dead Lionel slowly rose, the hole in his chest seemingly not impacting him in the slightest. He was already a heartless monster. He might as well look the part. Erdiel's note, bitch didn't even hesitate to betray him, LMFAO. And she wonders why he doesn't trust her. Chapter 2302. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 2302, Lionel's Web. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2302, Lionel's Web. His plot was quite simple, truth be told. Well, at least it was simple to Lionel. The actual thought required not only a deep understanding of his own people, but also how the enemy might be reading and reacting to his actions, the latter of which probably seemed far more difficult, when in reality both took quite a bit. After all, he had to understand his own people intimately, and often, the closer you were to a person, the easier it was to shroud their true intentions or what their weaknesses were in your mind. Lionel had known from the beginning that his entering the dream plane couldn't be hidden, and this wasn't quite his fault. N-0 Velbin. For one, in a world where so few had the ability, any new addition would be immediately sensed. Secondly, there was the fact that just by giving him a warning, Max was exposing Lionel to the elements. As such, Lionel had lost the right to work from the shadows from the very beginning, and he had to approach this in a different way. Since everyone thought him to be an arrogant young boy who thought too much of himself, why not play the part? After just a moment, he made the choice to not only not make a foolish attempt to hide himself from the world, but he also pushed it to the max, leaking out his aura any and everywhere and arrogantly making his presence known. To Vega, he probably seemed like a brash idiot whose dream force control was limited and crude. Of course, his dream force control truly was like that, at least compared to experts like Vega. He had great talent in dream force, but he didn't have the systematic training that those of the Dream Pavilion had, and he was almost entirely self-taught considering just how rare dream force affinities were in this world. That only made his ploy all the easier, but this was only the first part. None of this was enough to lure Vega in, or more accurately, none of it was enough for him to lure her into a situation where he had the de facto upper hand. That was where the latter stages of his plan began. The first leg came from the information he had gathered. He might have released Amory, but that didn't mean that he hadn't gotten anything out of him, and the information he did have wasn't restricted to the Suyard family either. As the fiancé to the heiress of the half-spirituals, how could Amory not have some information about his in-laws? Of course, this information was scarce, but it was enough for Lionel to be aware of the large-scale formation that protected the spirituals and also be aware of some of its baser functions, like the ability to lock down space. And then it came down to how he would use that information. He had learned from the 7 memory wells that he had absorbed just how useful the dream plane could be. It wasn't just about gathering up clues and knowledge while others were unsuspecting, but it could also be used to subtly suggest people. Of course, this wasn't an ability that could be used casually unless one had the ability index to match it, and even then it was hard to change a powerful person's mind. That meant you had to prey on their basal instincts, pulling at strings that already existed and make them looser, more susceptible to manipulation. This was what Lionel was certain the Demoness had done with the relationship between his father and uncle. Maybe she found it to be amusing, sealing away the talent of one and making the other the crown jewel of the human domain. Maybe she wasn't to see how interesting it would be if they fought it out, and maybe the reason she had stopped Lionel from using his own bloodline to save Aina was because she was unhappy with him ruining her experiment. Whatever it was, that sliver of understanding allowed Lionel to understand just how the dream plane could be used. It wasn't as straightforward as hiding what his plans were. He had to also be mindful of the mental state of his people and which of them could be used for what. And that was when he thought of the perfect plan. Yuri couldn't have been more perfect for this job even if she tried. In fact, even if he engineered a person to fulfill just this one role, he would just end up with a clone of her. The specialty of the spirituals array was that it was meant to protect the freedom of half-spirituals. Due to this, it couldn't be used against anyone with spiritual bloodline within them, and the formation ignored all those with that lineage. That said, Lionel couldn't just strap a rocket to Yuri's back and send her in. What good would that do? She was far too weak in comparison to overlords. Let alone an overlord, she wasn't even a match against the weakest of ancestors. However, if she was the one to act, the formation wouldn't retaliate, and thus she was perfect as a tipping point, a final push to get them over the hump. So he gave her a simple task. Once he collapsed the outer ring of the formation, she would take action. While shrouded in the power of the formation, the half-spiritual overlord wouldn't even sense Yuri before she acted. With a single strike, the overlord would fall without even realizing what happened, and then the rest would be easy. It was the perfect plan, and it took advantage of the greatest weakness of the spirituals. From Vega's perspective, it was also perfect. In fact, she would find it amusing how Lionel would try to mask his attentions by giving everyone in his army different decoy orders. With her skill, she could easily tell what was true and what was false. But that would be her downfall. She targeted Yuri immediately, peeling away the layers of protection on her mind. It was all too easy, especially since she knew that Aina was nowhere in this world. Where else could Aina be if not dead? And in the end she won. Or so she thought she did. All the while, she had been intertwining herself further into Lionel's web. Chapter 2303. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 2303, End Result? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2303, End Result? Lionel didn't seem to be in a hurry to make a move. He had the whole world in the palm of his hands. They moved to his rhythm, not the other way around. He gave the hole in his chest another glance before his force rumbled, and instant recovery activated. Being far stronger than it had been in the past now that he had evolved it to an 8th-dimensional lineage factor, even a beam that could kill ancestors instantly wasn't immune from his abilities. Quite quickly, the hole in his chest was fixed, and he finally gave Vega a glance. The Cross Elder still didn't look like much had changed on the surface, but what good were her facial expressions to Lionel any longer? He could see her very soul in the dream plane, and he knew exactly how shaken she was. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," Lionel said with a smile. "Though, I can't say that it is one even now. I've lost count of the number of times Shield Cross Stars has tried to kill me." The half-spiritual overlord frowned. She could feel that the formation had returned, but it was most definitely not in her control any longer. She suddenly felt like she was stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one side, there was the enemy that had come to take her down, and on the other side, well, there was an enemy that had come to take her down. Now, one of them was trapped within the formation she had thought was largely shattered, and she was trapped with them. Lionel gave her a knowing glance, but ultimately didn't say anything. This formation in his hands, especially now that his mind had connected to the dream plane, was more than enough to deal with all situations. Of course, he didn't plan on destroying the half-spirituals, and they were just another pawn in his game. But they didn't need to know that just yet. He had learned quite a lot in his short life, not the least of which was that people often didn't appreciate the things that were given to them on a silver platter. The spirituals had to understand that he was doing them a favor. The other races might be afraid of what the vast bubble had in store for them, but that hadn't stopped them from teaming up to attack his father, now had it? It was clear and obvious to him that many of them were trying to play both sides, trying to thread a needle that would allow them to live beyond their usefulness to the humans that ruled them from the complete world above. He didn't need fence-sitters. He needed people that would follow his orders properly. If he had to adjust for every possible betrayal like he did today, even he couldn't guarantee whether he would succeed or not. If he suddenly gained a bunch of people who had second thoughts about everything he did, just how much pressure would he be under to keep them all in line? He would be much better off just directly killing all of the people so that they wouldn't be a problem for him in the future. Lionel turned his attention back to Vega, but it seemed that the latter didn't want to speak. Lionel. The shriek was filled with rage, but Lionel only sent a glance toward it. Shut up. A violent pressure descended toward Yuri, and even the outer hull of her starship almost shattered to pieces as she shuddered. She almost felt as though her soul was about to be ripped out of her body and she seemed to snap out of her daze, but Lionel had already ignored her. He had been doing a lot of that recently. He didn't care to deal with Yuri, and she had always felt like a great annoyance to him. Of course, he understood her perspective and where her thoughts came from. He just didn't care. His own emotions were already wild and unfettered. He didn't have the time to help out someone else deal with theirs. The instant he looked back toward Vega, he raised a hand, and the starships all aimed toward her, each one gaining a clone they hadn't had before. Vega immediately began to shout out orders, causing a linked shield to form, but with a single blast, Lionel perfectly targeted all of their weaknesses, blasting them to smithereens. And then, he moved. Novi. LB-1 and golden dust particles danced around Lionel as his arm reached out, a black rod appearing. The black spear trembled, and a billowing black fog shot out from it. Its blades suddenly spanned dozens of kilometers, all wrapped in a nebula of golden dust. He used so much of the formation's power and so seamlessly at that the half-spiritual overlord felt her eyes bulging out of her sockets. Lionel was actually controlling each individual strand of golden dust as though it was its own weapon. Just what level of mind did it take to do that? The devastation was far beyond what the half-spirituals could have imagined. The ships of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross stars, each dwarfing a planet in size, were all suddenly split in two. As though a black hole vanished into a scythe's blade, rotating with golden stars, had suddenly decided to manifest between the tops and bottoms of their warships. It was a strike as beautiful as it was destructive, and final as it was pure. It was hard to imagine just how many had died from that strike. Not a single one was an ancestor, but even so, the blow was unimaginable. It might even be said that the very foundation of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross stars had been shaken. Vega looked upon this scene with the very same indifference, but her mind was in turmoil. She had taken him seriously. She had moved with full force. She had even used underhanded tactics against a child. Just how had this been the end result, exactly? Chapter 2304. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 2304. Follow my words. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2304. Follow my words. It was almost laughable. In fact, if she had been in the mood to do so, laughing was pretty much all she could have done. She had bided her time, waiting in the shadows, and only struck when she felt that she had all the information she needed at her fingertips. But not only had she failed the moment she took a step out, she had done so in such a resounding fashion. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Of the cross elders of S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Star, over half of them were here. There were only 8 remaining at base. If things continued this way, over 20 of their ancestors would fall here, and their ability to continue to control the situation would crumble. She couldn't allow this to happen, but she also most certainly couldn't allow herself to fall here. Selfish or not, her life was by far the most important. If there was no one present in the human domain that could counter Lionel's access to the dream plane, then it would all be Ovalban, follow my words. The voice was light and sweet, and Vega recognized them immediately. Of the high-profile targets, there was Velasco, and then there was this woman. She was a great talent, and if nurtured she could become a supreme asset to their cause. In addition, while she was arrogant, she had never painted outside the lines. She could be controlled and she could be guided. So while Vega kept one eye on her, she didn't make any moves to deal with her like she did the others. This woman was, of course, Cynthia Oman, the scorned Queen Beauty. But what shocked Vega was that she hadn't sensed when Cynthia entered the dream plane at all. Had she been wrong all along to not pay attention to this girl? No, that wasn't in her personality. She had most definitely done her due diligence, it just hadn't mattered in the slightest. Velasco had never bothered to hide his presence because of his arrogance, so she had known he was from the very beginning. In fact, she didn't dare to even probe him as Velasco was simply on another level compared to her. Unlike she who could only enter the dream plane in an incomplete world, Velasco was just like a king who could enter the dream plane even in a complete one. Lionel had been easy enough to spot because Max had somewhat exposed him, and the actions he took afterward were purposely bold and arrogant. But this woman. Vega's heart trembled. This incomplete world was always marked as an anomaly. They knew that there was a reason the last remnant of the Fox family had chosen this one of the dozens of others. And time again, they were proven correct as one monster after another simply appeared. Should she even listen to this woman? Clearly she was just as dangerous as the family before her, but she was also cautious enough to hide her intentions and bide her time for the perfect opportunity. How could she listen to her? What choice do you have? Vega shuddered again. Indeed, what choice did she have? Her heart trembled and her hands shook. Were these her own thoughts? Or was Cynthia manipulating her? When had she become so uncertain of herself? As though she couldn't hear these thoughts at all, Cynthia spoke easily and plainly. There is no way out of this situation except for sacrifice. Was that even true? Vega felt her head spinning. Did Cynthia have a way to get them out of here unscathed but preferred that her enemies not be too powerful? How could she even trust these words? The formation of the half-spirituals is powerful, but not to the point of being untamable. The issue is the son of Velasco has already claimed the initiative and taking it back from him is impossible. So, the only remaining choice is for you to flee. But you are trapped and space is locked. Whether it's reinforcements, or your own escape, neither will work. Even if you attempt to run out of the encirclement under your own power, the moment you leave the strongest core of your own formation, he will cut you down. He has his eyes on you and in his eyes, it's people like you who are the reason for his father's death. It is impossible that he would ever let you go, even if he has to let everyone else go. Vega fought hard to control her exterior emotions. By now, she was certain that Cynthia was manipulating her. She was a person who had always been in control of her exterior, at the very least. But now her entire mind was focused on it. What else could this be if not Cynthia's efforts? But it was the best kind of scheme, an open one your enemy knew was there, and yet had to fall into anyway. This was the method of the smartest individuals in the universe. In that case, if you want to live, you'll have to follow my instructions and sacrifice your people at timely intervals. Do as I say, if you want to live, of course. Lionel looked off into the distance. He had sensed another mind approaching this region the moment it happened, and though they were subtle, they couldn't hide from him. This meant one very important thing, though: this person was close. He knew just how difficult it was to travel across the dream plane while your body stayed in place. The further you moved, the further stretched your dream force became, and it was soon akin to a rubber band on its final legs. If you pushed too far, then not only would the rubber band snap, but even if you pulled back just before it did, it would lose its elasticity. He knew all of this. He had learned it not just once himself, but 7 times over through the memories he had sensed. So, why couldn't he find where this person was even though his senses were expanded across the solar system with the help of the formation of the half-spirituals? Chapter 2305. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 2305. Overlooked question: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2305. Overlooked question. Lionel's gaze became sharp, and he didn't move immediately. The next sequence of events happened so quickly it felt impossible to stop, but from start to finish, Lionel didn't even move. It was like he was resigned to it already. He stood and watched as Vega seemed to manipulate her own horde of ancestors, riling them up into a frenzy and leading them into a charge she never had any expectations of finishing off. He didn't move even when they seemed to show signs of putting his own life in danger, and he only made some faint and subtle actions when he saw that part of her plan seemed to encompass his starships and their fusion cores. In the past, Lionel hadn't been able to figure out how to separate the control shield cross stars had over their fusion cores from his control. Due to that, he had been unable to use the starships to attack other humans and the individuals of shield cross stars, especially. But since then, he had obviously overcome that weakness with his strength in crafting. However, there was a weakness that couldn't be stripped from fusion cores, and that was their susceptibility to instability. Vega obviously wanted to use this as a method to carve out a path of escape, and he just made a movement to stop this. In the end, the real reason Lionel hadn't taken any action showed itself as his people began to act oddly. Some starships turned to face one another, some began to directly battle without a word, and in the far-off distance, Yuri even seemed to be on the verge of directly killing herself. It was a house of madness. This shouldn't have been possible. The suggestive effects on a person's psyche should only be possibly by pulling at their already ingrained tendencies. Unless somehow every part of the Morales army wanted to kill one another, it shouldn't be possible even for someone in the life state to just suddenly turn them all on one another. At the same time, how could Yuri of all people try to kill herself? Not only was he certain that she had far more to live for than not, even if that was just to confront him about Ana's situation, but she had just broken free of a suggestion earlier. She would be on alert and couldn't possibly fall for another so quickly. What was most sinister about it all was that whether it was the Morales who had suddenly begun to battle one another, or Yuri who was trying to end her own life but seemed hesitant to do so, each one was targeting an ethereal glabella. It was so obvious and clear that Lionel was certain that whoever was doing it on purpose. If Lionel himself suffered a destroyed glabella, there would be nothing but death awaiting him. As for these people, even if he had the silver tablet, if their ethereal glabellas were destroyed, then their souls would dissipate much faster. If a few hundred died, he might be able to revive them all in time. But if a few thousand died, he knew he wouldn't be able to get to the last of them, so what about a few 10,000? 100,000? What if half of these tens of millions of warriors died in battle with one another? This person was not only showing him that they could do such a thing, but they were also telling him in no subtle manner that they also understood the weakness of his seemingly endless ability to revive others. Lionel continued to look around, a calm expression on his face as Vega rushed away. I see, so that's it. In the end, it was the formation. The spirituals' religion wasn't exactly one that worshipped the spirituals. Unlike the other religions that Lionel had come across, there was no deity, and rather nature itself was the deity of the spirituals. As a result of this, much of their strength also hinged upon this. Back in Valiant Heart Mountain, when Lionel met his first apostle of a god, Goddess Evergreen to be specific, the person in question had been able to tap into the power of their god and emit strength beyond themselves. It seemed that he hadn't understood the formation of the spirituals as well as he had thought. While he understood the skeleton of the formation, and the many pillars that formed its strength, he had missed the forest for the trees. It was akin to thinking of a baked cake as flour, eggs and sugar, rather than as a cake. What did the formation itself represent? Where did its strength come from? Yes, it was a natural force art that pulled on the power of the world, but what was natural about it? Where was the power coming from? The simple answer was a god. The god of the spirituals' religion. If Lionel had followed the God path, he would have picked it up much earlier, but he didn't follow the God path, he followed the path that Dimensional Cleanse had laid out for him, or more accurately, that he had laid out for himself. No-5 E/L/B/1 and due to this, he wasn't familiar enough with the God path and what its strengths and weaknesses were. Now that he thought about it, he had never really separated what empowered users of the God path either. Back in the Void Palace, when he had fought the henchmen of Trianavirur, the God path had manifested in tangible runes and physical signs. But he found that as he battled more powerful users of the path, there was no such obvious sign, or rather, he wasn't really looking for it. This culminated in him overlooking an extremely important question: what exactly was the God path and what were its strengths? What were its weaknesses? And in this context, how did it interact with the dream plane? Lionel had brought his people into a field of battle that he didn't understand, and his opponent had taken advantage of the terrain. After a moment, he snapped his fingers, and the formation was truly destroyed, but not before he shredded Vega's ancestors to pieces. The hold on his people vanished, but Vega used the opportunity to finally trigger a long-distance teleportation, disappearing from his sight. Chapter 2306. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 2306. Smart: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2306. Smart. Lionel's reaction was far too calm, but the reality was that it was hard to act surprised when you had deduced what would happen the moment it started. Had he wasted time trying to stop Vega, the Morales would have suffered casualties, and heavy ones at that. At the very least, upwards of 1 million would have died. For the casualties to go from 0 to that point, to this sort of level, he found it unacceptable. But it was likely that whoever was messing with his plans likely knew this and acted accordingly. Though it was doubtful that they expected Lionel to be so decisive. Unfortunately, whatever facade of a brash, unruly youth who was too full of himself wouldn't work anymore, but that was the least of his problems. He cast a glance toward the half-spirituals. In order to deal with the immediate problem, he decisively destroyed the formation. This time, it was truly destroyed and there was no coming back from it other than to rebuild it from the ground up. While he could have taken his time to find a less crude situation, the more time he wasted, the more Morales would have died. His speed of thought was fast, but not fast enough to analyze a path that he had little to no idea about, and then apply that to a formation that spanned an entire solar system. Even he wasn't that mighty yet. His most important takeaway from this event, though, was that this person was smart. Almost too smart. Lionel couldn't remember ever giving this sort of evaluation to anyone. It was a simple one-word description, and it wasn't overly flowery in his presentation, but it held the weight of the word when it was spoken by him. In order for this person to outplay him like this, they had to not only understand the weakness of his silver tablet and his lineage factor in combination, but they also had to be able to use an entire path and a formation they had likely never even seen active in person, to create this whole farce. But that wasn't the worst of it. That much was still acceptable. The truest problem was that for this plan to have worked, it relied on something else: the weakness of the Morales, their bloodlines, and their origins. To make a complex matter simple, this individual used the strength of the spiritual's formation to target the weakness of the Morales, dealing a blow to shield Cross Stars, the Morales, and leaving Lionel here dealing with quite a few enraged half-spirituals. As for how that was done, Lionel still wasn't 100% certain on the details, but he had a general framework. The spiritual religion emphasized oneness with nature. Their formation worked by sensing the life of the universe around them, melding into it, and allowing the power to wash over it. But it was also precisely because of this that it was turned around and used against Lionel. Oneness with nature could mean multiple things depending on the location, the person, and even the time. With that in mind, it was beginning to become clearer how this person had done this. There was now a large concentration of Morales in the surroundings. And what exactly was the innate nature of the Morales? This might be a hard question to answer until one remembered one thing: the curse of the Morales. As Morales men and women grew older, their lineage factors seemed to influence their minds and they became more battle-hungry and less reasonable. This was what had sparked the creation of the current Air Wars system and the short duration of rulership in the first place. Using the formation as a foundation, and Lionel's lack of understanding of it, this person had used the dream plane to amplify the innate weakness of the Morales, manipulating them into a frenzy. And, because everyone else was also in its sphere of influence, the very nature of the world around them began to change, and slowly people other than the Morales began to be affected as well. For Yuri, who was in a state of emotional turmoil, and was both hating herself for what she had done, and hating Lionel for putting her in such a situation, it had manifested in a way that it almost certainly never would have before. When things were laid out like this, it almost felt that Lionel's analysis of this person wasn't nearly high enough. Orchestrating this matter took no less than a genius who stood above all others. However, Lionel only felt that it was interesting. He had read through the entirety of the Void Library, and how could there not be explanations of the God path within? But they were all vague and abstract, as though even people of the human domain didn't understand how it worked. Now seeing it in action, he felt that the path was more interesting than he had given it credit for, and that was partly why his analysis of this person's strengths was so lukewarm. This was a strategy they should have saved, because it most definitely wouldn't work again. Of course, only Lionel would think like this. So, are we going to fight? Lionel asked, looking toward the half-spiritual overlord. The overlord didn't know what to think. The situation had changed so fast, and she didn't have nearly the understanding Lionel did of what had just happened. One moment Lionel had everything in his grasp, the next his people started fighting one another, and by the time it all ended their ancient formation seemed to have truly been destroyed. She still hadn't regained her bearings, and yet Lionel was now asking this question. But she was smart enough to understand the implication. Whoever had outplayed Lionel wanted them to fight. So should she follow the plans of that person? Or should she fall into Lionel's plans instead? No/LB, one and she suddenly felt indecisive even as her warriors looked raging for battle. Chapter 2307. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 2307. Step back if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2307. Step back. Lionel met the eyes of the half-spiritual, his gaze not giving anything away, though he knew the reality of the matter. If they fought a battle like this one, casualties would be inevitable, and not just casualties that he could casually revive either, true, final death casualties. It would take too much time for the war to end, and by that point, damaged ethereal glabella or not, the end result would be the finality of death. There wasn't much he could do about this. This was the reality of a war you weren't prepared for, and the striking difference was stark in comparison to the war he was prepared for. The decision would be in the hands of the half-spiritual overlord, but no matter how you looked at it, he didn't receive the kind of benefits he wanted from this battle. If things had gone perfectly, he wouldn't have only dealt a savage blow to the power of Shield Cross Star, crippling their strength by at least half, but he would have also been able to force the spiritual's religion into submission. But now, he might be forced to withstand some devastating losses himself. The overlord's thoughts were one matter, but the thoughts of her people were another. They all seemed enraged, and it was hard to tell how much control the overlord had over the situation. Lionel doubted that the spiritual's religion had just a single overlord, much like his Morales family most definitely had more than one as well. That old man couldn't hide such a thing from him. Who knew if the other overlords would be docile as this one? And even the so-called docile overlord was on the fence when deciding what to do. HM. Lionel suddenly looked up and shook his head. Fine. He waved a hand, and a portal manifested. Out from within it, a familiar old man with an annoying, shit-eating grin appeared. He rubbed his beard with a hand and chortled, liking this situation very much. This old man was none other than Amory's grandfather, Overlord Max. Ah, Tricilia, how've you been? Has this brat been annoying you? Max placed a palm on Lionel's head and rubbed just a bit too hard. Lionel tried to move away and even slap it away, but he failed both times, and if he tried a third, it would have been more embarrassing than just letting it be. He found this situation to be unbelievable, and at the same time, he was certain that this old man was doing it on purpose. No matter what, the Morales and Suyard families had been enemies for countless centuries. How could Max possibly miss a chance to humiliate their patriarch a bit, especially since he was here to help out with a sticky situation? Max? Overlord Tricilia spoke a bit hesitantly. Soon, though, she got a bit angry. She might have been slower in thought and duller in intelligence than Lionel or Cynthia, but she wasn't a fool. It was clear that Lionel and Max had some sort of mutual understanding. Were the Suyards betraying them? Since when had the Morales and Suyards been on the same side? Was there a Suyard army on their way here now? And hadn't they already decided to leave the Morales out of their alliance? That family's problems were too volatile. If the spirituals' religion had wanted to team up with them, they would have done so already, instead of making such a choice. After all, they had always assumed that choosing one meant foregoing the other, so they had discussed the matter at length, even ultimately choosing to give their best genius hand over in marriage. Knowing all of this, Tricilia truly did have the right to be more than a little bit enraged, and she almost gave the order to attack right here and now. Listen, I didn't want to do this either. Max raised up his hands. But this brat stole my family's world spirit and kind of forced my hand. I'm not saying to bend over backward, but you saw it yourself how there are powers at play here we can't deal with alone. It's best we work together. How is anyone supposed to trust you? Tricilia said with a growl. She simply didn't believe that Lionel could just take Max's world spirit. He must have handed it over. Were those hidden forces of the Morales stronger than they knew? Unfortunately for Lionel, Tricilia didn't seem to be the one of the spirituals' religion that had their world spirit, which was one part why he knew there had to be other overlords, and another part why she didn't believe Max's words. If you don't believe me, then why don't we go see Poppy? Max said. Tricilia frowned. Was this a ploy? Max chuckled and handed over his spatial ring with a flick of his fingers. Just me and the boy, you have nothing to worry about. Tricilia was stunned. That spatial ring might as well have been Max's wedding band. He never took it off, and it definitely held the greatest of his treasures. This either meant that he was going all out for this ploy, or he was really serious. However, she had known Max for years. This just didn't seem to be something that he was capable of. Just what should she do? Tricilia took a deep breath and shook her head. No. I won't let you in. NOV. LB/in. She threw the ring back, and Max shook his head. Well, you see that? I tried my best. Good luck in this battle, Max said with uproarious laughter. Lionel shook his head. He really wanted to see who had planned all of this. He couldn't wait to make them feel the same level of helplessness. He raised his spear, and he suddenly flickered and vanished. Max's hand, aimed to knock him out, missed completely. Max was a bit stunned for a moment. He had rubbed Lionel's head so easily earlier, so how had he missed? He shook his head again. This brat was sharp, too sharp even. He would likely cut his own hand trying to wield that blade he was born with. You need to learn when to take a step back, Patriarch Morales, Max said softly. Chapter 2308. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 2308. One last chance. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2308. One last chance. Lionel didn't seem surprised by the change. This couldn't be called a betrayal. Max hadn't been lying when he said that he had done his best. If Lionel was escorted to this overlord Poppy, as Max called her, then taking the world spirit of the spirituals would be as easy as just thinking it. By then, it would be clear that the Suyard overlord hadn't betrayed the spirituals and simply had his hands tied. But because Tricilia was so cautious, things had turned out this way instead. The best way to solidify this current rocky relationship was to use Lionel as a sacrificial lamb. Of course, this didn't mean that the Suyard overlord wanted to kill Lionel. He didn't have such intentions. Rather, knocking Lionel out would make corralling the Morales army easier, then the rest could be dealt with in the future. Unfortunately, Lionel wasn't as naive of the world as he had once been, and he had never been foolish enough to fall for such a bait and switch. He had already deduced that this would be the most likely result if Max failed to convince Tricilia, and he was prepared for it. The worst kind of scheme to deal with was one you knew was there, and yet had to fall into anyway. It seemed that the schemes of this hidden expert hadn't concluded just yet. Max knew that all of this was only happening because of the machinations of someone else, and yet he had to act in this way regardless. The spirituals' religion and the spirituals had already made their choice years ago. They had already planned to exclude the Morales. And now, this was just the next logical step. Looking into Lionel's indifferent eyes toward his change of address from brat to patriarch, Max almost felt like sighing. He felt as though he was looking into his own grandson's eyes. Even when he did the most ridiculous of things, this was precisely how Amory reacted as well. Overlord Tricilia was confused about the situation once again. She almost made the false assumption that this was all an act. After all, how could the likes of Lionel dodge an overlord strike without the support of the formation? But all of those thoughts were thrown to the back of her mind when Max took a step forward. The vast depth of space beneath his feet rippled outward like a pond. The chimes of swords echoed and an overwhelming pressure descended. Following that, there came a piercing sense that almost made Tricilia's heart stop beating entirely. Killing intent. I'm not sure I can deal with all your tricks and schemes if I battle you with the intent to capture you, so I will act to kill. This is the last chance I'm giving you to stand down, Max spoke lightly. Lionel wasn't even looking at him. His gaze went above, and then it moved below. This was the problem with battles in the depth of space. On flat land, the worst you could face was a pincer from 4 sides. And most often pincers would come in pairs. However, in this vast endlessness, where up and down were just figments of one's imagination and far more cultural than they were tangible, the number of directions you could attack from was infinite. Above him. Below him. To his back. To his front. Upward at an angle. Downward at an angle. There were half-spirituals everywhere. The only saving grace was that their formations were just as much of a jumbled mess as his own had become. I'll give you one final chance, too, Lionel replied, still scanning the battlefield. For every Morales that dies here, I will kill 2 Suyards. Is that the choice you want to make? Lionel finally looked up and met Max's gaze. The Suyard overlord finally seemed to see it. That endless, unfathomable depth. The corner of Lionel's eyes and his feet began to smolder. The ripples formed beneath Max's feet came to a dead stop over 100 meters from him, then they began to collapse on their own. Attack! Tricilia suddenly roared. The reaction was instantaneous. The powder keg of emotions the half-spirituals had been bottling up exploded forth. Beautiful men and women painted the skies like the descent of angels, a rainbow-like assortment of elemental energies rushing forward without restraint. The confusion within the Morales was high. The different changes to their mental states, followed by sudden combat in a situation they had just believed to be on top of, was devastating. N-O-V-E-L-/BI-/N. However, before the first wave of assaults could land, a calming voice had already entered their minds. Stand tall. It was just 2 words, and yet their spines shivered and the tips of their blades trembled. Roars escaped their lips one after another, and their force echoed across the plains. Don't be distracted. The whisper of a sword blade passed by Lionel's ear. He felt as though he had been cut in 2, the sensory perception coming even before the actual blade, like his mind and his body were being attacked at the same time. He could understand the kind of despair a person would feel facing such an attack. What was the point in dodging if you have already been bisected? But he shattered the mental assault as though it was as fragile as stale bread. His squadron was too far away from him for him to rely on their strength, but he didn't even bother to call them back. Their task was different. As for his task, it was to crush every ancestor that dared to stand before him. Lionel's aura flared. Arise. One after another, the corpses of the ancestors he had killed in the last several weeks appeared and then began to crumble as though all the strength of their bodies were being devoured into the rise of their souls. In an instant, Lionel was covered by 5 ancestors, each one emitting a sharp light as they raised their bows. These were none other than the ancestors of the constellation Biyao Alliance. Chapter 2309. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 2309. A mess if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2309. A mess. The ancestors of the spirituals religion, all of whom were ready to take action, felt as though their bodies had frozen. A dangerous aura locked onto them, and it felt like if they took just a single step in any direction, their heads would be pierced through. They were all ancestors, and Lionel was just using puppets. Just how could he have the strength to make them feel threatened to the point that they were immobilized? What they didn't know is that by having the ancestors consume their own bodies during the formation of their souls, they were actually at least 50% stronger than they would be otherwise. They were closer now to overlords than they were to normal ancestors. This was a lesser form of breathe that came from the weaker techniques of the Emperor's might lineage, known as cannibalize. It could be used on the corpse of a soul alongside arise to make them stronger. This, though, as an imperfect form of breathe, had some drawbacks. Normally, a soul would last 24 hours in Lionel's possession, but a soul that had cannibalize used on it would last no more than an hour. But this wasn't the only reason why the corpses felt so much more powerful. The real reason for that was because of the improvement to Lionel's dream force, namely his connection to the dream plane. Now, he couldn't just perfectly direct his soul constructs, he could infuse his own comprehensions and incorporate his very will into his commands. One could use the dream plane to push people in certain directions, but they would ultimately only act within the bounds of their own personalities. It would take many years of manipulation, and constant attempts to get someone to do something they wouldn't normally do. However, the will of Lionel's soul constructs was to do whatever he wanted them to do. That meant that his control over their impulsions was perfect. On the surface, this seemed like a minor thing. Couldn't he just control them with his mind normally? What was the use of this seemingly extra, useless step? But there was an important difference. Not only could Lionel command his souls to act and react faster, he could mold their minds and change their tendencies to exactly what he wanted. When it came to soul constructs like this that already had a foundation that matched his will, he could give them his skill in the bow. The 5 ancestors' auras roared to life. In that moment, their bows, which had just been surging with a silvery white bow force, seemed to shatter, streams of light dispersing and them reforming into a blinding golden streak. Right then, 5 bow sovereigns were born. And not only that, but they each had the power of an ancestor backing them. In a single bound, they went from a half-step to the overlord ranks, to true overlords. 5 overlord bow sovereigns. They had never been this powerful in their lives, but in death, they stepped into a realm of strength and power they could never have imagined. Max's expression became serious. He had only attacked once, and yet the situation had changed so resoundingly. Just how? Stop, don't. Max roared as he saw that Tricilia had taken out some sort of orb. If he could have stopped her from even taking it out in the first place, he would have. But that ship had already sailed. If Poppy comes here, your world spirit will be taken away in an instant. I wasn't lying, Novel B. 1 and Tricilia shivered and put the communication device away, but then a cold wind passed by her neck. She turned back slowly, and what she saw made her heart feel as though it had been hollowed out. 5 bows. 5 arrows. 5 echoing twangs. 5 deaths of her brothers and sisters. The ancestors of the spirituals' religion were still rushing forward, seemingly not even having realized that they died. But the bloody holes in their heads painted a different picture, one of bleak sadness. Could this have been avoided? Lionel didn't make a move, standing calmly. But it was like 5 of him were aiming their bows. Looking forward, neither Max or Tricilia could even quite feel their individual auras any longer. it was like they had instead become clones of the young man who stood in their midst. Max realized that he couldn't allow things to stay as they were. He moved like lightning, his very body seeming to carry the aura of the sword. 2 arrows appeared to his left and his right, but his absolute sword domain took shape, shredding them to pieces. His thumb rubbed along the spatial ring. Tricilia had returned to him and a rusted sword appeared in his palm. It looked as though a single swing might cause it to collapse, becoming nothing more than flakes of metal dancing in the wind. And yet, when he made his move, it was like the world had been split in two. Lionel looked into his eyes. People, relationships, complex webs of emotion. Nothing was ever simple due to these things. It should have all been easy. He already had Max on his side, his army had already surrounded the half-spirituals, he had already been just a step from victory. But things had ended up like this because humans were complex creatures that rarely, if ever, acted logically. He was no different, that he knew. As much as he tried to peel himself away from those more human layers of him, he couldn't escape it. He was realizing every day just how much pressure his future self had placed on him. He even understood that much of his cold logic came not from the fact that he was some sort of psychopath, or even from the fact that he preferred logic overall. It was just a coping mechanism. Looking at the world like it was an array of numbers, of buttons to push and sliders to adjust, that was much easier than looking at it for what it really was. An imperfect blob of a mess. The 5 archer overlords around Lionel shifted and seemed to form an odd force art with just 5 nodes between themselves. So, is this how it works? I guess so. Their auras doubled once again and Max's strength was drowned out. Chapter 23:10. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 23:10. Two-way street. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:10. Two-way street. Lionel didn't follow the God path, but his soul constructs did. It could be said that over 95% of all ancestors in the human domain followed the God path. There was a reason. It was the path that the Void Palace demanded of their students. It was the path that had allowed most of the elites of the human domain to rise up like they had. The actions of the mysterious person that had placed him into this situation made Lionel realize that there was more to the God path than what met the eye. But he, obviously, couldn't go back and choose a new path, and even if he could, he wouldn't. His intuition told him that dimensional cleanse was a far better bet for himself. But it got him thinking. Had he really reached the potential of his Emperor's Might lineage factor just because he had succeeded in comprehending its 3 strongest techniques? The answer didn't feel as obvious as it should. The 3 strongest techniques were meant to build upon one another, slowly building a foundation that could make the next and final steps logical. But Lionel had skipped all of that and went right to the strongest abilities of the lineage factor, ignoring much of its subtleties. In such a situation, how could he know with any certainty that he was pressing his potential forward to the greatest extent? His connection to the dream plane seemed to have only solidified that truth. He felt like he had been a child messing around with a toy, and that toy just so happened to be a loaded gun. That wasn't to say that Lionel was in any danger while using his lineage factor, not that he knew of, anyway. It was rather that he still didn't quite understand just how lethal it could be, and he felt that he had just taken a step toward understanding. Not only could he use the dream plane to pass down his own understanding to his soul constructs, but the reverse was possible as well. Like he had said, he might not follow the God path, but his soul constructs had when they lived, and if he applied some of the concepts of the spiritual's religion formation, and also some of the strategy of the mysterious existence that was toying with him from the shadows, then if he sprinkled atop of that some of his own theories on force arts, namely ones used in armies. The 5 soul constructs resonated with one another and they thrummed with life. The hum of nature echoed and the golden dust particles that were aimlessly floating in the air seemed to come to life once more. Of course, it was nothing like the truest formation. The use was limited as it didn't have the core of the formation any longer since Lionel had destroyed it. Lionel's understanding of the spiritual's religion's formation wasn't yet deep enough to simply reconstruct it using his soul constructs, but that was more than enough to send these overlords to their deaths. 5 arrows streaked through the air, and yet it felt like just one. Tricilia's chest was ripped apart and her body was sent flying backward like a broken rag doll. However, she couldn't even land, or even be sent flying into the endless distance, before she was shredded to pieces, even her blood being torn to ash. The soul constructs pulled their bows back once more and aimed toward Max, but Lionel shook his head and sighed as they fired. The arrows had only just left their bows when the soul constructs shattered to pieces. In the distance, their arrows weakened considerably, but still slammed into Max with an undying force. Max's chest caved in and his consciousness shuddered. It took everything he had to remain conscious, but he was still sent flying backward much like Tricilia. He was only lucky that he didn't have to suffer the same fate. Lionel shook his head. It seemed that using his soul constructs for more than just their base uses limited the time they could last even further. He had already felt that instilling them with his insight into the Bao had shrunk the time they had considerably, but it seemed that taking a step beyond that caused the hour he should have had to fall to just a few seconds. NOVE/L/B/ and even so, the outcome was still acceptable. It was unfortunate that he didn't have any more ancestor souls that were experts in the Bao in their lifetimes, but the fact Tricilia was dead and Max was on his last legs was a worthy trade regardless. Lionel looked toward the battle of the Morales and half-spirituals and shook his head. The casualties were about as devastating as he expected. It was a complete mess. There were no formations, none of the tactics he liked to use. Things might have still been fine had they been organized enough to make proper use of the armors he had given them, but they were too scattered to even do that. In addition, many of the armors that Lionel had constructed were purely auxiliary in function and only provided help when used in the context of an army. What could forming small-scale light illusions, for example, do in a battle like this? He took a breath, scanning the battlefield so quickly his pupils looked as though they were bouncing around his sockets. On a battlefield this large and expensive, his internal sight wasn't enough. At that moment, he wished for the complete Bao domain lineage factor more than he had ever before. Then, he stretched his dream force into the dream plane, immediately sending out tens of millions of orders, each one specified and unique for the person in question in an instant. It was time to turn this battle around before the other overlords of the half-spirituals could realize what was wrong. Even as he did so, his hand reached and grasped out, pulling the spatial device that Tricilia had taken out the communication device from before her soul or Max could react. Chapter 23:11. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 23:11. A best way if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:11. A best way. The battlefield became like a go board. The swiftness with which the situation changed was shocking, and in as little as a few seconds, the casualties went from about equal on both sides, to slightly lopsided, and then the Morales began to slowly take a firm upper hand. N/O/V/E/L/B/1/N. A Morales sharply thrust their spear, but retreated a moment later. He glided backward across the depths of space exactly 112 meters, only to sense a heat behind him as a part of his armor began to resonate. He didn't need to look behind him to know that someone with a matching set to his armor had appeared. They both acted at once, causing their force to roll and their armor to link. They both threw out another spear, the flickering light of illusion painting the skies. Their enemies couldn't dodge at all. How could they when they didn't know which spear was real? In another section of the battle, a single Morales found herself surrounded by 3 half-spirituals. Beaten and broken, there was no chance for her to escape. Her absolute spear domain roared with what felt like the last of her force, causing the enemies to take a step back, but it was only a brief reprieve as they rushed forward. Suddenly, there was a subconscious suggestion in her mind and she twisted her body. However, the light of hope came to an end as soon as it came. Her body was pierced by swords and a glaive from 3 sides. The pain shot through her like a torrent and she could feel her life slipping away. But that darkness of death didn't come like she expected. She had thought that she was dead for sure, but only now realized that the blades had missed her vital organs. No, more accurately, what was vital, what wasn't, the line between life and death, that was decided by her, wasn't it? The spear domain lineage factor. No, the Moralis lineage factor. What did it mean for the absolute spear domain, a pure offensive ability, to fuse with their metal bodies and their divine armors? She felt that she had a vague idea. She released her spear, causing it to vanish. She grabbed onto the two sword blades, pulling down and snapping them before throwing both broken blades into the brows of their owners. At the same time, her spear suddenly appeared behind the head of the glaive wielder, shredding them to pieces. Two Moralis brothers, sharing the same branch bloodline, pressing their backs to one another. They trusted each other with their lives, just like they always had. They would make it out of here just like they had every time before. One of them gritted his teeth with determination, blood trickling down his chin until his heart suddenly felt hollow. The solid back pressed against his suddenly went limp. He could feel the life of his brother draining as a sharp blade pierced an inch into his back. He didn't need to look to see what had happened. Someone had just driven a blade through his brother's heart so far that it had almost run through him as well. The Moralis looked down and watched as a familiar spear drifted down beneath his feet. Once again, he didn't need to look to see what had happened. His brother had thrown his spear away, grabbing onto the sword with both hands so that it wouldn't drive through him as well. A suggestion pressed onto his mind as he roared in fury, his absolute spear domain raging like a torrent. The energies of the world were suddenly being swallowed with a vicious momentum. The metal body of the Moralis could assimilate metals and earth. This was the foundation for many of their strongest techniques. Metal body. Divine armor, countless others. This ability, though, was built off the back of an insatiable greed to devour, a greed that reminded this Moralis brother a lot of the metal spirit. He really wanted to be one. He really wanted to swallow everything in his path, to rampage with fury fueling his mind. His absolute spear domain rushed outward, swallowing all the force in the surroundings, assimilating them, and then using that strength to shred everything in his path apart. They would pay for the death of his brother. Lionel breathed heavily, sweat drenching his brows. In the past, he had created a technique to help his brothers improve and keep up with his steps. He called it Dream Path. Unfortunately, this ability was one of the few that he had created with the help of his ability index that didn't work out well. As a result, he had only used it once on his brothers, but ended up abandoning it. But after awakening in the dream plane, he had come to understand some things. He still couldn't just draw out a path for a person, and he had overestimated himself far too much when he thought that he had the ability to. Instead, he could sense the small kernels of inspiration they had brewing in their subconscious and push them forward. There were millions of Moralis, each with their own ideas, each with their own thoughts on how to progress, but many of them found themselves tied down. Either they hadn't reached the perfect circumstances for enlightenment, or they were so tied down by tradition and hierarchy that they didn't dare to strike out on their own path. However, seeing through their thoughts, Lionel realized that maybe there was no right way or even a best way to use a lineage factor. There was a huge array of application methods, and each one had its own viability. This was only more so for a recently mutated lineage factor like their own. So he gave them the nudge that he deserved. The battlefield became a mixture of continuous breakthroughs and squadrons that quickly became teams, and teams that quickly became battalions and battalions that quickly became armies. Just when the tide was firmly on the side of the Moralis, the overlords of the spirituals' religion finally realized that something was wrong. Chapter 23:12. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 23:12. Over. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:12. Over. Lionel sent a glance toward the planets below, his breathing labored. Not far from him, Max and Tricilia were still trying to gather themselves. Tricilia wasn't a threat. As a half-spiritual, after losing her body, while she could survive, she was far weaker. He could probably defeat her on his own even without relying on a formation or his soul constructs. Max was in a state of great weakness right now. He was nigh incapacitated and only barely managed to hold on to his consciousness. He wasn't a threat, at least not on his own. He could still launch an attack if it came to, but Lionel still held back from trying to deal him a final blow. This old man was definitely not simple. Even if you pressed a normal animal into a corner, they could lash out, let alone an ancient beast. Lionel took a breath, trying to catch his breath, but he realized that he was practically hyperventilating. He was breathing so heavily based on a reflex, not because he needed to. That much was proved by the fact his breath was actually so controlled rather than causing waves of hurricane-force winds like it usually did. The fatigue was soul deep, it was a depletion of his dream force and a fatigue of his mind, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was nothing like a bodily fatigue might be, no amount of breathing hard would help him. With a thought, his 3 dream stars took shape and began to rotate with a fierce momentum. Lionel suddenly gasped and it felt as though he finally caught his breath. His gaze sharpened as he felt the difference and his plan changed. He had forgotten. The manifestation of his stars wasn't just a method to accumulate dream force quickly, nor was it just a representation of his universal cycles. It was the manifestation of his path, the path of dimensional cleanse. In an instant, he found that he could travel much further in the dream plane, and every action he took stripped away a lesser amount of his dream force. He sent out more commands, and suggestions that were more precise. The efficiency of his control over the Morales army skyrocketed even as the overlord of the spirituals, the woman he assumed to be Poppy, rushed out from her hiding spot. He sent out a final wave of orders as he snapped his attention toward the coming ballista. Poppy was another beautiful older woman, but she had a fiery temper that rivaled that of a bubbling volcano. Her hair was a shortcut blaze of red, her eyes just as piercing red. Lionel would have thought her to be a Brazinger if he didn't know better. At the moment, 10 shadows appeared by Lionel's side. "Is it done?" Lionel asked. Joel tossed an orb at Lionel. Lionel nodded, but the confusion on the faces of Max and Tricilia practically formed tangible phantoms. That orb. It was definitely the communication device that Lionel had just taken from Tricilia, but these 10 hadn't been by Lionel's side from the beginning. That meant. Max's gaze turned solemn. That meant that Lionel had sent them on a mission before even getting his hands on the communication device, before he had even seen Tricilia take it out. The realization hit Tricilia at the same time and her heart trembled. Her gaze turned to her fellow brothers and sisters in the distance. Every moment, another one of them fell, and they weren't lucky enough to maintain their souls like she had. The Morales directly targeted their weaknesses. Somehow, many of them had gained the ability to kill them with a single strike. "Easy enough," Joel said. With the orb, the location was as easy as breathing to find. Lionel had sent the 10 on a simple mission. Their goal was to find the entrance of the spirituals' religion Holy Land. Any communication device required a receiver, and any such receiver would give off fluctuations. If the communication device was modified under a crafter as skilled as Lionel, the receiver would become no different from a beacon. Of course, Lionel didn't need to send them for just this. If it was just this, he could have found the location from right here. There were 2 things he needed. The first was to lure Overlord Poppy here. What better way than to send enemies to her resting place? The second was to find the core of the formation that Lionel had been forced to destroy. As he had predicted, the moment Poppy was alerted, she noticed the problem going on outside and had no choice but to rush here. While she did that, these 10 had brought the shattered core she had been forced to leave behind here. As expected, Raj tossed something at Lionel soon afterward. It was just a ring, but within, there was a shattered core the size of a planet's core. N/0 Vialbin. Lionel shook his head. Luckily, he had sent Anastasia with them, or else putting such a thing into a spatial treasure would have been impossible. And even further than that, it was lucky that he had chosen the method of shattering the formation core that he had. Lionel hadn't just indiscriminately shattered the formation. Instead, he had treated it like a puzzle, following along the fissure lines and only breaking them along those weak points. Due to this, it was not only far easier to rip apart, but, due to his crafting skill reaching the molecular level, It was also far easier to put back together. Boom! The entire battlefield froze. Every warrior, including Poppy, Max, and Tricilia, felt like their bodies had been marred in cobwebs of time and space. Before, the core of the formation had been light years away, and Lionel could only use an endless chain of commands to control it from an obscene distance. The design of the formation made this possible, as it was designed to be used across the entire solar system, but that didn't mean that it didn't have its weaknesses. Now, however, the core of the formation was right here. This battle was over. Chapter 23:13. Published at 13th of November 2023, 7:52 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 23:13. Kill if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:13. Kill. Everything came to a stop. There was no moving forward, no retreating, and everything danced in the palm of Lionel's hand. After a moment, Lionel exhaled a breath and shook his head. He looked out into the battlefield once more, and his gaze flickered with rage. The casualties were atrocious. Almost 10% of the Morales army was either dead beyond his means to revive, or heavily injured. There was another 10% on top of that were dead, and he might have a chance to revive if he was quick enough. 20% of an army of this caliber and size was a devastating blow, especially when the total had been at 0% for the past several days. These were the most elite of the Morales 7th dimensional experts. The only ones missing among them were the Nova heirs, at Lionel's request. Every loss of one was not only one less that they'd have, but it would also be a great detriment to the future potential of the Morales in the short term. It was simply infuriating that something like this could happen when it could have all been avoided. Max wasn't supposed to be his enemy, but he had made such an idiotic choice in the end. When he spoke of killing 2 Suyards for every Morales that fell, he hadn't been lying, but it also wasn't just an act of rage that he wanted to mete out. The history between any two forces had to be taken into account whenever they were moving forward in any sort of conflict or cooperation. Real Morales had died due to Max. Their parents would grieve, their wives and husbands would carry that pit in their hearts for a lifetime, their spouses, their children, their friends, each one would be impacted in their own way. How could they just forget everything and move forward in cooperation with the Suyards? The original cooperation that Lionel had wanted now was dead. He had tried, he had made concessions, he had even laid down his own fury toward these families and their inaction as his father fell on his spear. And yet this was how they repaid him. The smoldering lines of black began to appear around Lionel again, but just as quickly as they had, he snuffed them out, his gaze returning to a cold depth of indifference. His actions might have seemed crude, he might have even been seen to have pushed the Suyards and the spirituals' religion to this point, but he knew what his intentions were better than anyone else. He had left Max alone after taking the world spirit. He had proved himself by entering the impetus state with his dream force and countering Vega. He had had no intentions of slaughtering the half-spirituals when he came here, and the entire brunt of the attention he had given had been focused on killing the ancestors of S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Stars. He had been bold, a bit crude, and a bit strong-handed, but these had all been necessary actions. If he came, hat in hand, trying to form alliance bonds with these two powers, what would the result have been? In the best case, he would have been laughed out of the room. In the worst case, they might attack to kill him due to his role in linking the Morales and Earth, the soon-to-be only 2 eighth-dimensional worlds of the human domain. He had chosen to forgive, to forget, not only their actions in not aiding his father, but also in their intent to pressure the Morales just to keep their families safe. Did the spirituals' religion not send a representative that day? Did the Suyard family not place a pawn in the Void Palace and use it as a proxy to pressure his Morales family? He had been too kind. Bang! Max was forced to his knees under a resounding pressure. There was no land to stand on, and yet the space beneath his kneecaps cracked and shattered, forming a pseudo-land just for him. The golden dust particles around him swam and then formed powerful chains, piercing through his shoulders, his chest, and then, finally, his knees. Then, they bound around his body tightly. Soon, the same actions were repeated for Tricilia, and the Poppy in the distance. Despite the latter being the only one of them that wasn't injured at all, under the weight of the formation, it was all worthless. Lionel raised a hand and a strong pull came from Poppy's very soul. Her eyes widened as the world spirit was torn out and brought to Lionel's palm. With a squeeze, it was shattered and the half-spirituals, all at once, felt a sense of laws that trembled their hearts and caused their eyes to water. Compared to humans, the spirituals were far more sensitive to this sort of matter. Their world spirit subconsciously felt no different from family to them. After he was finished, Lionel began to use the formation to speed up the process. He didn't have to gather force the normal way since the formation could accumulate so much of it. Thanks to this, the force he needed to revive the members of the Morales were readily available. Luckily, he managed to revive almost the entire 10%, only missing out on a few, a result that was much better than he expected. There was nothing he could do about the ones that were gone before he got his hands on the formation, but this would have to do for now. Lionel looked toward the army. His expression was the mask of coldness and he could see every Morales looking at him with the same steely intent. He knew that this was exactly what the person lingering in the shadows wanted. There was no better scheme than one your enemy knew was there, and yet had to fall into anyway. Right now, though, it didn't matter. For the sake of the future, this was the best step to take. The only step. Kill, no V/1B. In the roar of the Morales shook the solar system. Chapter 23:14. Published at 13th of November 2023 7:52 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 23:14. Satisfied? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:14. Satisfied? The fallout of the battle rocked the human domain. The slaughter of both the spirituals' religion and the Suyards was akin to watching the fall of titans from their mountain. These two powers had always been seen to be on par with the Morales, and yet the Morales alone, after taking out 12 constellation families just weeks ago, followed through with a campaign that brought these two to their knees. And it was all led by Lionel Morales. It felt like a curtain of silence had fallen over the human domain. It was inescapable. Many felt that such infighting, when they had only just survived the invasion of several domains just months earlier, was inadvisable. If there was a scale of public perception, it had easily begun to swing from fear of the Morales, to a lambasting for their actions. How could the public know of the intricate details of the events that had occurred? And even if they had an actual chance at knowing, would that mysterious figure, hidden in the background, and spurring on those very same flames of hatred, let it go so easily? This was exactly what they wanted. To paint the Morales as savages, as demons that didn't understand the true weight of the situation, and there was no better mascot for their displaced fury than Velasco and his son after him. Rumors of Velasco toying with the taboo and thus bringing down the rage of the gods spread like wildfire. Watching as his son now led armies to take down families that had lived for countless generations only seemed to bolster these thoughts further. How could a child like Lionel possibly bring down these families if there wasn't something nefarious at play? Many even began to believe that if they really allowed the Morales to take control of the human domain, and thus left Lionel to be their de facto leader, rather than the gods coming down to smite Velasco on his own, it might even be the whole domain that was wiped from existence. The moment this sort of paranoia grew legs, it soon grew wings and soared through the skies. It passed through countless ears and affected countless hearts, and it only grew worse as the details of the past events began to be spread in earnest. First came news of just how thorough the destruction of the spirituals' religion was. The spirituals' religion had quite a positive public perception in the eyes of many. They never led crusades like the other religions, and humans always had a sort of innate awe of the spirituals. In addition, such a group of beautiful men and women, how could they possibly be hated? If it wasn't for the fact they only accepted half-spirituals into their ranks, the largest religion in the human domain might actually be them. And yet, Lionel had not only plundered their ancient formation, but he had razed their lands to the ground. The territory of the spirituals' religion was just a single solar system unlike the Suyards that controlled many sectors filled with many more galaxies, and so every act was akin to the impetus of a genocide. Being so small, the spirituals' religion simply had no large group of weaklings that the large families and organizations did. As such, Lionel had gone to each and every one of their planets, waging a bloody, one-sided war until he forced them all to their knees. And it was precisely this picture that the human domain received. But this was nothing compared to what happened to the Suyards. The half-spirituals only suffered a loss of life. The Suyards, however, suffered a loss of dignity, of pride. Even the willingness to raise their heads high had been crushed, no different from when Lionel had kicked down their doors of their sword faction. Max was chained to the front of Lionel's starship. Every battle, he was forced to watch as his Suyard family was crushed and split to pieces. The fervor of the Morales, as though unleashing a wave of countless years of animosity and hatred, spilled over like a tsunami. The holy land of the Suyards were razed to the ground and their spirits were crushed. Amory, their greatest hope, faced off against Lionel in battle once again. Legends of their battles had spread like wildfire, and many believed that another legend would be painted on this day so long as Lionel didn't use his king's might lineage factor, and yet the result. Lionel crushed Amory. There was no suspense. He didn't even bring out his spear, it simply wasn't necessary. It wasn't until now many remembered, the last so-called legendary battle between these two had taken place when one was in the 6th dimension and the other was in the 7th. They were never on the same level to begin with. Ovelbian one after another, the ancestors of the Suyards were bound and captured, chained up and thrown into the dungeons of the Morales. It could be said that for the first time since the founding of the Suyard family, their capital lands were vacant and empty. Lionel might as well have burned the crops and salted the earth. For every Morales that dies, I will kill 2 Suyards. He had said those words, and he meant those words. Locke, the envoy of the Suyards, truly had to watch as his home was burned to the ground. Lionel speculated that it was never Max that told him to speak those words. It might have been another ancestor of the Suyards, or it might very well have been that mysterious figure that had been goading him into a trap from the very beginning. But none of it mattered. Are you satisfied? The voice was gruffer than before, but that made sense, considering Max's state. Lionel glanced over but didn't care enough to say something. If Max wanted to avoid this, he should have never acted against him. Your grandfather would have never done this. Max continued, much of his hair covering his eyes. Lionel didn't care to respond directly to that either. Rest up, Lionel said indifferently. From now on, the Suyards will be the vanguard of the Morales. A force art, complex enough to split one's mind if it was gazed at too closely, whirled in his palm. Chapter 23:15. Published at 14th of November 2023 10:46 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 23:15. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:15. Cruelty. Max looked toward Lionel's back, his words escaping him. He should have known, someone like Lionel wouldn't be so easily swayed by moral arguments. Even the most caring of people would have their bottom line, let alone Lionel. What Max could have never guessed was that there truly was a point in Lionel's life where the pull of his morality ruled him. Over the years, those thoughts had been overruled, taken over by a man who killed without hesitation and shed blood without blinking an eye. It was difficult to tell for an outsider whether this was the fading of a youthful vigor and naivete, or if it was something else, something deeper. Lionel, as oblivious as he seemed about his own emotions sometimes, was very much aware of everything happening within him. Even if he missed something, with his memory, he could go back in time, so to speak, watching the changes that took place step by step and understanding what had brought him to this place. Max would never know the answer because Lionel would never tell him. The old overlord had his own reasons for doing things, and so did Lionel. Seeing that Lionel was about to walk away, unmoved, Max shook his head. The Morales family was simply not to be trusted. These weren't words he thought of due to Lionel, though at this point, even he couldn't deny the animosity that was building up in his chest. Rather, it was pointed toward the hidden undercurrents within that family. If Ishmael was still alive, things wouldn't have gotten to this point, and maybe he would have been marrying his son to an heiress of the Morales instead. But such things couldn't be deliberated over now, especially when things had already reached this point. Lionel had won. For now. And it seemed that his Suyard family would be forced to be hitched to this wagon. Whether they sunk or swam would be all reliant on the shoulders of this cold and detached young man. Lionel stuck to his word, he would turn the Suyard family into the vanguard of the Morales. He knew what kind of words were spreading about him and the Morales now, and since these were the thoughts that everyone in the human domain would have about him, he would simply lean into it. He knew how these kinds of storms worked. No one would believe that he suddenly became benevolent and started to treat the families he had conquered well. Even if he did, whoever was in the shadows could spin it any number of ways. For example, what if that person planted the seed that those captured by Lionel would be turned into his loyal soul puppets? And that the only reason he seemed to be treating them all well was because he had already captured their souls just like he had shown many times before. The abilities of the fox were powerful, but Lionel had no doubt that it had created quite a number of enemies for them over the years. A family that could one day in the past do a favor to the race like the Pluto, and yet end up regulated to just one descendant locked away in an incomplete world, most definitely couldn't have fallen so far without many powerful individuals wanting it to be the case. And right now, Lionel was watching that play out in real time. He made a mental note to himself that he would likely have to be far more cautious with how he displayed his king's might lineage factor once he left this incomplete world. But for now, there was no use in fretting about it. It was too late to win the war of public perception, and his actions in releasing the young heirs of the weaker 7th-dimensional and 6th-dimensional families was wasted, but that was fine. One of the markers of a great general and strategist wasn't just how good their initial plots were, but also how they adapted to changes in the field. So, he wouldn't try to win it at all. Yes, the Morales family were a family of demons. What were they going to do about it? Lionel got to work not long later. His plan was simple. Right now, what remained in his way was the remainder of Shield Cross Stars, the Omen family, the Void Palace and the Godland family. Shield Cross Stars was mostly crippled, as was the Void Palace. His greatest worry was that the most powerful of Shield Cross Stars, aside from Vega, hadn't made their moves yet. These were existences like Cross Elder Avon and Overlord Sith. He had been avoiding the Omen family until now because he knew they would be the most difficult to deal with. They were the only family capable of mitigating the advantage of Lionel's linked armies because they had wealth and crafting skills comparable to the Morales. Of course, Lionel didn't believe that there was anyone who could match up to him in this regard, but he was just one person. The spirituals formation had already threatened him a great deal. Who knew what the Omen had prepared? Especially since the Tier 2 starship design that he had improved came from them in the first place. The Void Palace was most crippled too, but there were still hidden cards of the cult that had yet to make their presences known. Lionel hadn't forgotten about the large center of variant invalids that they should have, nor the large number of savants that the Void Palace should have accumulated as well. As for the Godland family, they were a complete wild card. He knew nothing about them, and the souls of the pious ancestors had been completely in the dark. This time, though, Lionel wouldn't be attacking. The time for pushing and launching assaults had ended. He had antagonized the human domain enough, and his next series of plans would only antagonize them more. The next phase of this war would be played on his turf. All were welcome. He would be happy to send them to the grave. One by one Lionel began to brand the experts of the Suyard and half-spirituals that remained, turning them into the loyal warriors. As he did so, the final straw that would break the camel's back descended. A group of demons, wearing Morales armors and wielding Morales spears appeared in the depths of the Void Palace. There were just 100 of them, but each one radiated a towering aura. As for when they worked together, even the sturdy lands of the Void Palace crumbled and shattered. One by one, they killed every elite of the Void Palace. Nominal disciples, quadrant disciple, galaxy disciples, sector disciples, domain disciples, it didn't matter. Rivers of blood ran and each of their corpses was desecrated. Each had a hole in their forehead the size of an ethereal glabella. The demons didn't even try to hide their movements as they returned, paving a streak of crimson across the cosmos as they made their way back to Morales land. Then, without a word, they disappeared. All that remained of the once mighty Void Palace were the corpses of the most promising youths of the most powerful families of the human domain. The powder keg exploded. Chapter 23:16. Published at 14th of November 2023 10:46 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 23:16. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:16. Names. No losses. Lionel looked toward the small troop of 100 demons, somewhat surprised. He had sent this troop into the Void Palace without his support, with only a single goal: kill. Of course, there were some other caveats about time constraints, efficiency, and the like, but he had ultimately left it up to them to decide the details. The troop was the first batch of his experiments with the golden-scaled koi fish and the tentacle womb. It was years in the making, but it was finally bearing fruit. It was just that he had been waiting to use it at an optimal time. This time, he decided to use them to provoke the human domain. What could be a better tactic to provoke the ire of these powers than to kill their children and their future? He could imagine just how enraged they were now, and whatever plans they had been making would most definitely move forward. But standing here, right here and now, he was shocked. According to the report these demons had brought back, they hadn't just managed to kill a small number, they killed all of them. Not only did they kill all of them, but they didn't lose a single member of their original 100. This troop, his first troop, was built based on the cobra demon that had eaten Lionel alive. They all had beautiful, sapphire scales, and their necks and heads were covered in the natural hood of a cobra. Each one stood at over 2 meters tall, and they radiated a dense cold. Their armors matched this cold, fusing them and amplifying them. Lionel had added some of his comprehension of Void Star Force, but honestly it was limited and not his best work, as he had created these armors even before his breakthrough in crafting. His thought process was that even if this cobra demon troop was caught and dissected, they wouldn't look any different from normal demons, and on the other hand, his enemies wouldn't have any idea what his current crafting skill was at. But the end result was beyond his expectations, and his provocation had worked almost too well. Looking at the storage device filled with ethereal glabellas, he didn't even quite know what to say. He had personally created, from one cell to a complete living being, an army stronger than the greatest elites of the human domain? He shook his head and sighed. From the moment he learned of the abilities of the silver tablet, he had felt that life was far too worthless, and here he was confirming those ideas once more. It was hard to accept for someone like him, whose journey of morality and its push and pulls had once given him the conviction to save all beings. It was funny, in a morbid sort of way. Back then, he thought that all lives were equal because they were each immeasurable. Now he thought the same, but only because all lives seemed to be equally worthless. It was a foundational difference that led to the same conclusion. But what made it worse was the legend of the Northern Star. Life could be created so casually, it even felt that the life and death of those born in these incomplete worlds was no different from a breeze riding the rays of the sun, fleeting and without substance. And yet the end of the world was looming on the horizon, and no one seemed capable of stopping it. These things, how could both be true? Why were they both true? What kind of sick joke built the fabric of reality as it was? Lionel looked toward the demons, his gaze a bit blank. Right now, he was striving to bring his future wife back to life, striving to see his father stand broad and tall once again, but if he really succeeded in either, just what worth did they ever even have? It was a thought he had been running from, and it was like he was being forced to confront it, ironically due to creations of his own. What was more important to him? That lives were worth something more substantial than an outpouring of resources? Or that he could always bring those he loved most back to life? If he could bring those he wanted back with a thought, if he truly ever reached a level of power that allowed him to be infallible to such an extent, would acting on his power diminish the worth of the lives he had wanted to save so much? He didn't know the answer. It was another question, one maybe even more profound and complicated than the one that had guided his journey until this point, and it came with a depth of suffocation and helplessness that was even heavier than the first. Lionel gazed toward the demons again. They stood tall, none of them knowing what thoughts were running through the mind of their creator. Their intelligence was no less than that of the demon that Lionel had fought back then, the strength no less as well. In fact, they were stronger, having been constructed to the level of the 7th dimension rather than the 6th. What made the reality all the heavier was the fact that this demon wasn't even from an incomplete world. "What are your names?" Lionel suddenly asked. "Skriri." The roars of the 100 threatened to shatter Lionel's eardrums, and Lionel actually began to laugh. He didn't understand their language, but he no longer needed to. With the dream playing, he could sense the intentions of their words directly. Their names? They didn't care about them. They had never had one. They only wanted to fight, to bleed for strength, to crush the bones of their enemies beneath their feet. All of the more complicated things, even if it was just a name, they didn't care to have one. It was a simple and beautiful existence, and one that he unexpectedly envied. Chapter 23:17. Published at 14th of November 2023 10:46 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 23:17. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:17. A good look to not care, to be carefree. He wanted it, but his mind wouldn't seem to allow him that sort of peace. It was all too easy for many to focus on the next step forward, to chase that next goal, to aspire towards something larger than themselves, but they rarely thought about what it meant to sit at that height. If you really did have the power to wave a hand and make everything you want come true, to force it into being, would it all even be worth it? What a uselessly human thought, Lionel thought, still laughing to himself. He was laughing because he could already see himself taking it for granted, as though he would definitely reach that height, as though he would be proposed with this question one inevitable day, and when that time came, what choice would he make? The question was too complicated, too marred by his own biases, and maybe if not for the level of thought he had achieved, he might not have even considered the question in the first place. I really hate you demons, Lionel thought to himself, shaking his head. Demons had almost killed him more times than he cared to admit. A demon had eaten him alive. Demons were infiltrating his Morales family. A demon was supposedly his grandmother, toying with his life since even before the day he was born. If this was a novel, he'd feel that the author was far too on the nose with his motifs and literary themes. What a condescending whack job. His life truly looked as though it was the greatest joke. How many existential crises was he going to have? Well, this didn't really feel like an existential crisis. He felt calm as he faced these questions, and it wasn't because he knew the answer, or because he felt that the answer wasn't as important, but he was already certain of what he would do. He didn't know whether they would be worth the same, but he knew that he couldn't allow his life to go by without trying to see his father again. He couldn't allow that silly girl who never listened to him to go to the grave without seeing those that had harmed her mother to be buried first. Even if he found out that their worth really had plummeted just by virtue of his actions, he was too selfish to not try anyway. And for the first time, just thinking these thoughts, Lionel felt that he had finally understood something about himself, his true self. For as long as he could remember, he hated to lose, so much so that even if it required crossing the benefits of his own brothers, he would rather win anyway. James had first-hand experience with this matter. That day during the championship game, he had known there was something wrong with James. James himself had tried to bring it up earlier in the day, and Lionel had had plenty of opportunity to ask about it. He just chose not to. He chose not to because he didn't want to face the decision of what to do himself. He didn't want to be split between his own desires and helping out someone he cared for. So he had avoided James. He hadn't allowed James to tell him about his plight. Even up until this day, he still didn't know exactly what sort of issues James had faced that day. And why was it? Was it because he hated to lose that much? No, it was deeper than that. He was selfish. He wanted it all. He wanted his brother by his side, and he wanted victory. He was insatiable, and there probably wasn't anyone who could turn him from his own goals. How foolish was it to ask the woman out over 500 times? Even if you felt that she might be interested in you, wouldn't it be obvious after the first handful of times that she had worries and troubles that went beyond her liking of you? He had ignored that. His charisma had made those around him ignore just how ridiculous what he was doing was too. They had even begun to cheer him on, looking forward to the day that he would finally receive his answer. He had manipulated them for his own goals much like he manipulated everyone else to suit himself. He hadn't cared about what troubles or worries that Aina had had, because all that mattered to him was her saying yes. He didn't care about what might have caused her to be hesitant. All he wanted was that answer. It was something that was constant. It was maybe his one constant. He left his brothers behind on Earth, brothers that he had known since he was a toddler, all to chase a woman who hadn't even given him an affirmative yes yet. Their lives were on their line, and they had actually died. But he didn't care. Aina told him many times that she wanted him to take better care of his life, that she had already lost too much in her life and she didn't want to lose more, that the lives of everyone he was trying to save weren't worth as much to her as his own. But he hadn't cared, even up until the point she had chosen to leave him. It didn't matter to him, he was on his own crusade, he had a savior complex back then and he didn't even know how much of that was genuine emotion versus a childish hatred of the fact that he had, well, lost. Thinking about it could make someone quite sick to their stomach. Did he really make the decision to unify the dimensional verse because he wanted to save people? Or was it because his failure in the Valiant Heart Zone stirred his selfish desire to win? How much had it really mattered to him if he was willing to sacrifice the lives of those thousands of warriors that had called him brother, just to revive the brothers that were only dead because he had abandoned them too? Lionel looked down at his hands. They radiated the familiar bronze color of the Morales family, but in his eyes right now, they just looked beaten and bloody. He had finally gotten a good glimpse of himself, free from the restraints of an almighty future self, and his conclusion was quite something. He had never been as good a person as he thought himself to be. Chapter 23:18. Published at 14th of November 2023 10:46 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 23:18. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:18. Worth Lionel wasn't too shaken by the conclusion. He felt that everyone was selfish in one way or another. The problem was that he was selfish, and he also had the ability to enact his selfishness without the burden of judgment. If you could always manipulate everyone into doing what you wanted them to do, what worry did you have to have about backlash? This, though, was still a bit of an excuse, and he knew it. This was his reality, and he had to decide whether he wanted to change or not. But it wasn't that simple, because there was a very strong pull leading him in a certain direction. He still had a strong conviction to save his father and Aina, and he simply didn't see that changing. Lionel clenched his fist and suddenly vanished. Lionel stood high in the skies a long while later, staring down at a devastated scenery. This place was familiar to him, and it could be considered his true first stint into the wider dimensional verse. It was Valiant Heart Mountain, the place linked to maybe the most growth he had experienced in his life. It was a place he owed quite a bit, but just like everything else, he had left it quite selfishly. He had taken everything he wanted from it, and then he had directly abandoned it. Bits and pieces of it were now part of his people, those like Rayon and his wife. Emna was also a remnant from this part of his life. But the mountain was no longer anything. The people that had once called this place home, the elders that had given their entire lives to protecting it and helping it to grow, the excited youths who put their lives on the line just for a chance to enter. It was all reduced to dust now, crushed until nothing remained. Lionel descended and landed on the ground, standing along what remained of the wide road that led to Valiant Heart Mountain. In this place, two mighty pillars had once stood. It was they that pressured the disciples on their ascent up the mountain, and it was also they that also opened the Valiant Heart Zone. Lionel closed his eyes, breathing in the air. The planet was weak, so weak that if he took a breath that was too deep, the trees that had managed to survive the catastrophe of this world would be ripped out and tossed into the air. He remembered the first time he had come to this world. He couldn't even make a dent in the ground with his spear, let rip a tree out from it. And yet, it all felt so feeble. The faces of many crossed his senses. Rollin. It had been a long time since he had thought of that name. He was the best friend of the general, the character he had become in the zone for those 2 years, or was it a character? Roland had truly become his best friend. He was different from James. He wasn't a playboy, he had a loving wife, Elise. He was less braggadocious and boisterous, but he was earnest and he had a kind pair of eyes that could melt the soul. His wife was a perfect match for him. She was weak and didn't have any talent for improvement herself, but Roland cherished her like a man should his wife, and she had begun to bear his child. When the zone closed, she had yet to give birth, but Lionel knew how hard Roland had fought just to give her and their child a chance to look into the skies with a smile on their face. Goggles. That pragmatic youth who refused to put his life on the line for anything. And why would he? With his ability index, he never had to. But he had chosen to fight for Lionel, to ignore his usual baser instincts and fight for something larger than himself. Gertrude. That fiery, red-headed young woman. She had once been a noble woman, but she abandoned her status because she felt that the actions of King Alexander the Apex were vile and disgusting. She had a temper that could rival a dragon's, but a heart of gold. He knew quite well that she was in love with him, but he had ignored her feelings. Even though he and Aina had already been on a rocky road back then, she was still the only woman for him. But she didn't deserve what happened to her. None of them did. He squeezed his eyes shut tighter, but the single tear came anyway. He exhaled a breath. "I'm sorry." It was a hollow voice in a silent world. There was no one here to hear it. The ones that deserved to hear it were long gone because it was an apology that was long overdue. Rumble. Lionel's eyes sharpened as they snapped open. It was a risk to come here, he knew that. War would break out soon of the Morales world, and yet he was here reminiscing. However, when he saw what was before him, his pupils constricted. A portal, a familiar one. It was the Valiant Heart Zone. He could feel it in every sense of the word. He hesitated, but he eventually stepped in. It was all the same. 2 years wasn't even necessary. A few hours wasn't even necessary. Even a few minutes felt excessive. He crushed the zone that had once taken his years to complete in not even a fraction of the time. But he felt every second as though it was years. What was the trade-off? He was so powerful now that he couldn't build those relationships again. He didn't get to bask in Roland's kindness, in Elise's sweetness, in Goggle's sense of humor. And why would he? He was far above them, he was an existence beyond even their understanding. The tyrant king that they had feared for so long could only be strung up like a chicken in Lionel's palm. And then, he stood before the silver tablet once again, entering its world and looking at the endless spirits who this time, instead of seeming illusory because of their deaths, look as real as could be. He had enough force within his own body right now to revive them all if he wanted, he wouldn't even need external treasures. But that question came back to nag him. If you stood at the top of the world, with the strength to make anything you wanted to happen come into existence. If you acted on that strength, would its worth still be the same? Lionel grabbed the silver tablet and poured his force into it. His body acted without his mind's consent, disregarding the question entirely. All he wanted was this pit in his chest to disappear. Somewhere a long distance away, a sigh that Lionel couldn't hear echoed. Chapter 23:19. Published at 14th of November 2023 10:46 and 33 seconds AM. Chapter 23:19. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 23:19 never existed. Lionel looked at the various souls floating around him and felt a hint of excitement that was doused quickly. How could he remain excited? While it was true a burden that had been weighing him down for so long was finally off of his shoulders, there was another matter that was harder to accept. After a bit of hesitation, he reached forward toward Roland's soul. Roland was someone that Lionel had met long after his falling out with James. After what happened between him and his longtime best friend, Lionel truly didn't think that he would ever connect with a person on that level again. He and James might have been complete polar opposites, but they worked in a way that Lionel simply couldn't describe. That wasn't to say that Lionel thought more of James than his other brothers, that wasn't the case at all. Some parents might lie when they said they loved all of their children equally, but Lionel wasn't lying at all when he said that he loved all his brothers the same. What differentiated his best friend from his buddies wasn't how much he liked James, but rather how well they clicked, how well they played off of one another, how well James seemed to compliment him. Now that he understood a bit more about himself, Lionel knew exactly why this was too. Would it even be him if it wasn't for a selfish motive? James was a simple-minded brute and he was all too willing to deal with Lionel's manipulation. But at the same time, he was sharp and intuitive in a way he himself probably didn't understand. He could pick out Lionel's flaws in a way that others simply couldn't. In a lot of ways, James was like Lionel's litmus test. If he could pull one over on James, then his actions would go unnoticed. In truth, Lionel knew he had probably tipped the scales a bit too far out of his favor. Yet, he was a selfish person, but he didn't believe that he had crossed the line to evil, villain, mastermind just yet, treating James like some sort of science experiment. Even so, he knew that there was some truth to this for certain, because although Rollin was also a polar opposite of James, he reflected those very same core traits. He could see through Lionel's nonsense, he could cut right to the core of whatever was ailing them, and if anything, he was a bit sharper than James was, at least when it came to actually articulating his thoughts. He actually reminded Lionel a lot of Joel, their personalities were nearly identical. And it was amusing because if Lionel had to choose which friend he was the second closest to outside of James, it would be Joel. Their drunk escapades and night of cuddling painted that picture quite well. The difference was just one thing: Joel didn't tolerate Lionel's nonsense at all, once again proven by that drunken night. It was Joel that had brought the liquor that day, and it was Joel who forced Lionel to see that he was less okay than he tried to pretend to be. Lionel didn't want that kind of best friend. Joel wouldn't just call him out like Rollin, or tolerate him like James, he would try to force Lionel to change, and it made sense. Joel was a captain in his own right. While on the football field Lionel had been the captain of the offense, it could be said that when the defense was on the field, the leader wasn't Lionel at all. After all, he was on the sidelines. It was Joel who took control of their defense, he was the quarterback of the defense. When he put it that way, it was almost sad. Maybe if Joel had been his best friend instead, or rather if he had allowed that to happen, he could have saved himself a lot of pain. But why would he? Why would he allow someone to change him? Did a person as selfish as himself even have that sort of capacity? Lionel grasped Rollin's soul and it shuddered. He undid the restrictions and allowed Rollin to break the final barrier to life. Rollin practically popped into existence, looking around in confusion for a moment. When he noticed Lionel, he immediately bowed deeply, and it was precisely this that made Lionel sigh. How could this Rollin be the same as the other? Of course, no matter how quickly he had completed the zone, he and Rollin were still slated to be best friends. After all, it had to be remembered that it was Rollin that had given Lionel the first clues on what his role in that zone world would be. But that was the general, and Lionel was Lionel. Rollin hadn't had any time to acclimate to them being the same person, and the Lionel that had entered was so far and beyond the best friend he had known that they easily became two separate existences in his mind. To Rollin, his best friend had long since died and the Lionel before him was a completely different person, a person that had crushed King Alexander, the tyrant that had ruled them all for so long with absolute ease. If for no other reason than to ensure his wife remained safe, he couldn't afford to neglect showing proper due respect. Any camaraderie the two had seemed to have gone up in a puff of smoke. Lionel knew that even if he explained things clearly, it wouldn't change a single thing. The Rollin of now and the Rollin that he fondly remembered would never be the same person. Lionel stoically resurrected them all one by one, the familiar burden that he thought he had left far beyond weighing him down once more. Goggles' previous gusto was nowhere to be seen as he looked around shifty-eyed. Gertrude didn't have that familiar infatuation in her eyes when she looked at him. And Elise, her stomach was decidedly and glaringly flat. Their baby was dead. Or rather, It had never existed in the first place. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.